My father gave me a rotting farm in upstate New York and gave my brother a $4 million luxury apartment in Manhattan. When my mother saw what I had built out of the ruins, she marched onto my property and said I had 48 hours to give the place back to them. She said my brother was taking over. When my brother arrived in his muddy pickup truck holding a crowbar to break into what he thought was a collapsed barn, his face went completely dark at what he actually saw. My name is Erica. I am 33 years old, and I spent the last 3 years turning a financial black hole into a $15 million corporate retreat. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to take credit for your hard work. It was a crisp Saturday morning in the Hudson Valley. The air smelled of pine and fresh rain. I was standing in the grand courtyard of the Astor estate. It was a breathtakingly restored 19th century manor that I had poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and savings into. I am a boutique hospitality developer. For 3 grueling years, I lived in a tiny trailer on this property. I worked 16-hour days managing contractors, sourcing historical materials, and securing commercial permits. Now the estate featured a pristine gravel driveway, luxury tasting rooms, and manicured gardens that rivaled any 5-star resort in the country. That morning, my staff was busy setting up for a high-end tech summit. Caterers were carrying trays of crystal glasses. Florists were arranging massive displays of white roses. Everything was running perfectly. Then the peace was shattered. The heavy wrought iron front gates swung open. My mother Linda marched right through them. She wore her signature designer coat and carried a heavy leather purse. She completely ignored the staff working around her. She walked with the kind of aggressive entitlement that she had used to control our family for decades. I watched her approach, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach. But I reminded myself that I was not a terrified child anymore. I was a successful businesswoman standing on my own property. Linda did not even offer a greeting. She walked right up to a pristine cocktail table and slapped a thick legal manila folder onto the crisp white linen. "You have 48 hours to pack your bags and hand over the keys," she demanded. Her voice cut across the courtyard loud enough for my event manager to turn and stare. "Chase is taking over the property." I looked at the folder, then up at my mother. I did not flinch. "Mom, I am hosting a major corporate event in 3 hours. You cannot just barge in here and make ridiculous demands." "This is not a ridiculous demand, Erica," she snapped. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "We have been very patient with you playing party planner up here in the woods. But it is time for the man of the family to manage this asset. Your brother needs this property, and you are going to sign it over to him by Monday morning." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the cold morning air. To understand the absolute absurdity of her demand, you have to understand what happened when my father Thomas passed away 3 years ago. My father was a wealthy man who always favored my older brother. Chase was the golden boy. He was 36 years old and had never worked a hard day in his life. When the will was read, my father left Chase a fully paid-off $4 million luxury apartment in the heart of Manhattan. It was the crown jewel of my father's assets. And me, I was given this property. At the time, it was a dilapidated, tax-heavy, rotting farm that the entire family considered a massive financial burden. The roof of the main house had collapsed. The barns were structurally unsound. The property taxes alone were enough to bankrupt a normal person. My family laughed when I inherited it. They thought my father was punishing me. They thought I would go broke trying to maintain a pile of rotting wood. They told me to sell it to developers for pennies just to get rid of the debt. Instead, I saw potential. I used my background in hospitality development to draft a massive business plan. I secured independent loans. I hired crews. I rebuilt the entire estate from the ground up, turning it into the most exclusive corporate retreat in the region. I did it entirely on my own without a single dollar of help from Linda or Chase. And now, 3 years later, my mother was standing in the middle of my success telling me to hand it over. "Why on earth would I give my business to Chase?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Dad gave him a $4 million apartment. He has his own inheritance. Linda rolled her eyes as if I were a stubborn toddler. Your brother has had a run of bad luck in the city. He needs a fresh start. And let us be honest, Erica. You are just a single woman. You cannot possibly manage a property like this long term. It is too much responsibility for you. Chase is ready to step in as the head of the family and take this burden off your hands. You should be grateful he is willing to help. Grateful. The word echoed in my mind. She wanted me to be grateful that my brother was going to steal my $15 million empire. I realized right then that nothing had changed. In her eyes, my hard work meant absolutely nothing. My success was just something to be harvested and handed over to her precious son. I am not going anywhere, Mom, I said smoothly. I picked up the manila folder and handed it back to her. You can take this back to whatever cheap lawyer drafted it. This is my property. I built this business, and Chase is not getting a single square inch of it. Linda's face turned red with fury. How dare you speak to me that way, she hissed. You only fixed this place up using your father's good name. You owe this family. If you do not hand over those keys right now, we will make your life a living nightmare. Just as she shouted those words, a loud, obnoxious engine roared in the distance. A massive mud-covered pickup truck came speeding down the road. It turned sharply and violently crunched onto my pristine gravel driveway. It parked diagonally, taking up 3 spaces meant for catering vans. The driver's side door swung open, and my brother Chase stepped out. He was wearing dirty jeans and a smirk on his face. In his right hand, he was literally holding a heavy iron crowbar. I knew exactly why he had it. He thought he was arriving at the abandoned, rotting farm he remembered from 3 years ago. He thought he was going to have to pry open a rusted padlock on a collapsing barn door just to get inside. Hey, Erica, Chase yelled, not looking up yet as he slammed his truck door. Mom said you were giving us some trouble. Do not make me break the locks on this dump. Then he finally looked up. He stopped dead in his tracks. The crowbar slipped slightly in his grip. I watched his eyes dart from the beautifully restored brick facade of the main manor to the glowing crystal chandeliers visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the tasting room. He looked at the impeccably dressed staff carrying trays of champagne. He looked at the luxury sedans arriving at the valet station. His smug, arrogant smile vanished completely. The color drained from his face as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. He had come here expecting to seize a worthless patch of dirt. Instead, he was standing in the middle of a $15 million corporate empire. I crossed my arms and stared right back at him, feeling a deep, thrilling sense of satisfaction. My family had always underestimated me. They had always treated me like the disposable daughter. But today, they were going to learn that the girl they threw away had built a fortress they could never conquer. Chase let the iron crowbar slip from his grip. It hit the gravel with a heavy thud. He pushed past me, his muddy boots marching directly toward the grand double doors of the main manor. I signaled my security team to stand down. I wanted him to see it. I wanted them both to see exactly what they had thrown away. This was the moment of absolute truth. Chase and Linda aggressively toured the property like conquering generals inspecting a newly captured city. They walked through the vaulted tasting rooms where rare vintages lined the custom-built mahogany walls. The floors were polished reclaimed oak, giving the space a warm, inviting glow. They paced through the manicured botanical gardens, examining the carved marble fountains and the state-of-the-art outdoor kitchen pavilions. With every step, I watched Chase's initial shock rapidly curdle into a ravenous, consuming greed. His eyes darted from the imported silk draperies to the catering trucks unloading cases of expensive champagne for the weekend tech summit. He was calculating the revenue, the profit margins, the absolute fortune surrounding him. This was no longer the rotting, tax-heavy burden our father had dumped on me 3 years ago. This was a gold mine, and Chase looked starved. Linda followed closely behind him, her hands clasping her designer purse, her eyes wide with immediate entitlement. She ran her fingers over the polished bar in the executive lounge, nodding to herself as if she had personally overseen its installation. Neither of them asked about the 16-hour workdays, the sleepless nights, or the terror of taking on millions in commercial loans to save a dead farm. To them, the money was simply there, and therefore it belonged to the family. Chase finally stopped pacing in the center of the grand foyer. He tilted his head back, taking in the restored cathedral ceilings and the massive antique chandelier suspended above us. "You really outdid yourself, Erica," he said. His voice was thick with unearned arrogance. "It is a nice little setup you have got going here, but it is time to let the adults handle the real business." I stood near the reception desk. "This is my business, Chase. You have your luxury apartment in Manhattan. You have your legacy, and I have mine." Chase let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the marble floors. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He smoothed it out on a nearby table, treating the paperwork like a loaded weapon. "Dad left you a pile of dirt," Chase sneered. "He left the true legacy to me and Mom. And part of that legacy means protecting the family wealth from people who do not know how to properly handle it." He tapped a specific paragraph on the document. "I assume you never bothered to read the full text of the family trust agreement. It is dense, complex legal jargon. Not exactly the kind of thing a party planner would understand." I knew exactly what he was holding. I had read our father's will 1,000 times. "Let me summarize it for you," Chase continued, stepping closer to me. "There is a specific commercial clause buried in Section 4. It states that if this rural land ever generates a commercial profit exceeding $1 million annually, the family trust has the right to step in and claim a mandatory 50% controlling stake." Dad put it there to preserve the family wealth in case the land got bought by a commercial developer. But this works just as well. Linda stepped up to stand right beside her son, forming a unified hostile front. She looked at me with that familiar condescending gaze she had perfected during my childhood. "Erica, you need to stop being selfish," Linda commanded. Her tone was devoid of any maternal warmth. "You have had your fun playing business owner, but this is entirely too much responsibility for a single woman your age. Chase knows how to handle corporate assets. You need to support your brother's future. It is what your father would have wanted." Her words brought a bitter taste to my mouth. It was the exact same argument she had used when I was 18, demanding I give up my college savings so Chase could invest in a failed startup venture. His mediocre efforts were always rewarded, heavily funded, and endlessly praised. My straight-A successes and relentless hard work were always dismissed as trivial. I remembered the evening I received my college acceptance letter with a full academic scholarship. Linda forced me to hide my celebration, demanding I stay in my room so I would not upset the golden child. Now standing in the foyer of a $15 million estate that I had meticulously designed and funded myself, she was demanding I shrink away once again to protect his fragile ego. I looked at the paperwork Chase had spread across the table. "You expect me to just hand over half of my company and give you full managerial control because of a piece of paper you dug out of a drawer?" "I expect you to comply with the law," Chase shot back. His face grew red. "The trust is controlled entirely by Mom and me. We are invoking the clause today. If you do not sign over managerial control by this afternoon, I am calling the local sheriff. I will freeze your business operations immediately. I will shut down this tech summit, lock the gates, and drag you into a legal battle that will drain every dime you have left." He was leaning over the table, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He expected me to crumble. He expected the quiet, obedient sister who used to shrink away from conflict to burst into tears and beg for mercy. He thought I was a financially illiterate scapegoat who would panic at the mention of the sheriff. He thought I would surrender everything I had built just to keep the peace. Instead, I felt my lips curve into a slow, chilling smile. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers closed around the heavy, cold brass of my master keyring. It held the keys to the tasting rooms, the executive suites, the wine cellars, and the massive wrought iron front gates. I pulled the heavy brass ring from my pocket and tossed it directly into Chase's chest. He scrambled to catch the keys before they hit the floor, looking completely baffled by my lack of resistance. "Take them," I said, keeping my eyes on his. "Manage it, Chase. Invoke your clause. Call the sheriff. Lock the gates. You can have absolute control over the family trust's assets. But you might want to read the fine print first." Chase clutched the keys in his fist. A smug, victorious smirk spread across his face. He puffed out his chest, looking at Linda as if he had conquered the world. He thought he had won. He genuinely believed that his simple intimidation tactics had successfully secured his financial future. He thought he had just bullied his way into a $15 million fortune without lifting a single finger. He was completely blissfully unaware that the wrought iron front gate was the only physical asset the family trust actually owned. His downfall would be spectacularly painful. Chase stood in my courtyard clutching the brass keys to the front gate, completely oblivious to the reality of his situation. He puffed out his chest and looked at our mother as if he had just conquered a nation. They climbed back into his muddy pickup truck and sped off, leaving deep tire tracks in my immaculate gravel. They genuinely thought the war was over. They thought they had legally cornered me with a buried trust clause. They had no idea I had been playing a completely different game for 3 years. 2 days later, a heavy cream envelope arrived at my office. It was a formal summons from Linda, disguised as a dinner invitation. I was expected to attend a mandatory family dinner at the Oak Ridge Country Club in Connecticut to finalize the transition of the property. The country club was my mother's absolute favorite place on earth. It was a fortress of old money where the carpet smelled of expensive scotch, and the members communicated entirely through passive-aggressive insults. I knew exactly what this dinner was. It was an ambush. It was a public execution of my independence disguised as a civilized family gathering. I dressed carefully for the occasion. I wore a tailored navy suit that projected absolute authority, and I carried a structured leather purse. Inside that purse, my smartphone was fully charged with the voice recording application already running. I tapped the record button as I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the club. The hostess guided me to a private dining room at the back of the establishment. When I walked in, I saw that Linda had not just invited Chase, she had summoned the entire extended family. Aunt Susan and Uncle Richard sat on one side of the long, polished table. Cousin Gregory and Aunt Miriam sat on the other. They were the family jury. These were the aunts and uncles who had spent their entire lives worshipping the ground Chase walked on while treating my existence as an unfortunate footnote. Chase sat at the absolute head of the table, acting like a king holding court. Linda sat to his immediate right, practically glowing with smug satisfaction. They had deliberately left the chair at the opposite end of the table open for me, placing me as far away from the power center as possible. I took my seat silently. I ordered a sparkling water with a twist of lime and folded my hands in my lap. I did not offer a warm greeting. I simply waited for the tribunal to begin. Linda clinked her fork against her crystal wine glass to command the room's attention. She looked down the length of the table at me with an expression of performative maternal concern. "Erica, we are all here tonight because we love you, Linda," began her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We have been watching you exhaust yourself up in the woods playing hospitality manager. But the family trust has to be protected. Chase has invoked his legal right to take over the estate, and we expect you to step aside gracefully. It is time to let the adults handle the real business." Before I could even respond, Uncle Richard leaned forward and pointed a thick finger at me. "You have to be realistic, Erica. You only managed to secure those construction loans because of your father's good name. The bank saw the family legacy and took a chance. You are coasting on Thomas' reputation. It is a miracle you have not bankrupted the whole operation yet." Aunt Miriam chimed in immediately, her jewelry clanking as she reached for her wine. "Running a commercial property is not like planning a little garden party, dear. It requires a ruthless business mind. Chase has a natural instinct for high-level finance. Remember his investments right out of college? He just understands wealth preservation in a way you simply do not." I took a slow, calm sip of my sparkling water. I let the cool liquid slide down my throat while their words echoed in the private dining room. I let the voice recorder in my purse capture every single syllable of their coordinated psychological abuse. I remembered Chase's investments right out of college perfectly. He had dumped $200,000 of our father's money into a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme and lost every single penny. My father had quietly bailed him out to save the family from embarrassment. Meanwhile, I had worked 3 jobs to pay for my own graduate degree. Their dialogue was a perfect mirror of my entire childhood. Whenever Chase failed, they bought him a new car to cheer him up. Whenever I succeeded, they told me not to boast because it was unladylike. Now they were sitting in a luxury country club, aggressively gaslighting my achievements. They were trying to convince me that the 16-hour workdays, the calloused hands, the flawless vendor negotiations, and the massive corporate contracts I had secured were just lucky accidents. They wanted me to believe I was incompetent so I would hand over my empire without a fight. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my business acumen. I did not scream about the unfairness of it all. I just sat there looking directly at Chase. "So Chase," I said, my voice perfectly level, "you think you are ready to run a $15 million corporate retreat. You know how to handle the elite tech clients and the massive payroll operations." Chase laughed out loud. He leaned back in his leather chair and swirled his expensive scotch. He was getting drunk on his own ego, entirely convinced that my silence was a sign of total surrender. "I am not going to run a corporate retreat, Erica," he scoffed. "Running a hotel is a joke. It is pennies. It is manual labor. I am thinking much bigger than your little party planning business." Linda nodded proudly, patting his arm. "Tell her, darling. Tell her the real plan." Chase set his glass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. He looked at me with a predatory grin. "I am not keeping those old brick buildings. I am not dealing with caterers and groundskeepers. I have already signed a preliminary letter of intent with a massive corporate developer out of Boston. They have been looking for prime Hudson Valley real estate for years." The entire table went completely silent. My aunts and uncles leaned in, hanging on his every word. "We are going to bulldoze the entire estate," Chase announced proudly. "We are going to clear out all those historic gardens and tear down the manor. The developers are going to pave it over and build 50 generic luxury condominiums. The location is perfect. They are offering a flat $12 million for the land and the commercial rights. We close the deal by the end of the month." A cold, sharp realization washed over me. He wanted to destroy my life's work. He wanted to crush the beautiful historic estate I had poured my soul into just to build cheap concrete boxes. He did not care about the family legacy. He only cared about liquidating my blood and sweat for a quick payout. $12 million, Uncle Richard whistled, impressed. "That is a massive return on investment. Brilliant move, Chase. But why the rush?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "Dad left you a $4 million luxury apartment in Manhattan free and clear. You have zero mortgage. Why do you need to bulldoze my business for a quick $12 million? Chase waved his hand dismissively, avoiding my eyes for a fraction of a second. "I just need the cash liquidity right now to clear up some minor Manhattan investments. It is high-level financial strategy, Erica. You would not understand. I have some creditors looking for immediate capital, and I need to restructure my portfolio." He took another large gulp of his scotch, trying to project total confidence, but his hand was shaking slightly. In that exact moment, the final puzzle piece snapped into place in my mind. The picture became crystal clear. Chase was sweating. He was rushing a terrible real estate deal to get his hands on liquid cash. He was talking about restructuring portfolios and paying off creditors. A man who owned a $4 million Manhattan penthouse outright did not need desperate cash liquidity unless he no longer owned the apartment. I stared at my brother from across the table. I connected the dots instantly. Chase had squandered his entire inheritance. He had already blown through the $4 million apartment my father had handed him. He had likely taken out massive loans against it, lost the money, and was now facing absolute financial ruin. He was secretly bankrupt. He was drowning in debt, and his only way out was to steal my property and sell it for parts before his creditors destroyed him. Linda looked at me, expecting me to burst into tears at the thought of my beautiful estate being bulldozed. She expected me to beg them to save the historic buildings. I smiled. It was a genuine, terrifying smile that made the hairs on the back of Chase's neck stand up. I picked up my purse, ensuring the voice recorder had captured his full confession regarding the corporate developers. "Well, Chase," I said, standing up from the table, "it sounds like you have everything completely under control. Good luck with those minor Manhattan investments, I turned and walked out of the private dining room, leaving my family to celebrate their imaginary victory. They had no idea that they were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. Chase was bankrupt, and he had just confessed his entire illegal strategy on tape. I stepped out into the cool Connecticut night air, feeling absolutely invincible. They wanted a war over the family legacy, and I was about to give them a spectacular corporate bloodbath. Exactly 1 week later, the Hudson Valley sun bathed the Astor estate in a warm golden light. It was the second day of our most lucrative booking of the year. I was hosting a highly exclusive weekend retreat for the executive board of a major Silicon Valley tech firm. This was not a simple garden party. It was a flawless, high-stakes operation. My staff moved with silent precision across the manicured lawns, carrying silver trays of artisanal espresso and locally sourced breakfast pastries. Down by the restored lake house, a team of tech billionaires was concluding a morning meditation session before moving into our custom-built glass meeting pavilions. The entire estate ran like a perfectly oiled machine. I stood near the entrance of the main banquet hall, reviewing the afternoon catering schedule on my tablet. I felt a deep sense of pride. This was my empire functioning at its absolute peak. The serenity of the morning shattered when a loud commotion erupted near the front valet station. I looked up and saw Chase marching up the primary cobblestone walkway. He was completely ignoring the protests of my head of security. Chase was not dressed in his usual casual clothes. Today, he wore an overly tailored suit that looked like it belonged in a cheap financial commercial. He was projecting an aggressive, unearned swagger strutting across the property as if he had personally laid every single brick. Flanking him were 3 older men in sharp, expensive business suits. They carried leather briefcases and looked around the estate with calculating eyes. I glanced toward the front gates and saw exactly how Chase had managed to get past the initial security checkpoint. A black luxury SUV was parked illegally on the shoulder of the private road. The passenger side window was rolled halfway down. I could clearly see my mother Linda sitting inside. She was wearing her oversized designer sunglasses and a deeply satisfied smirk. She was too much of a coward to step onto the property and do the dirty work herself, but she was absolutely desperate to watch my public downfall from a safe distance. She wanted a front row seat to my humiliation. Chase spotted me standing near the banquet hall doors. His eyes lit up with predatory glee. He quickened his pace, marching directly into the center of the outdoor networking area, where several of my high-paying tech clients were enjoying their morning coffee. He did not ask for a private meeting. He did not pull me aside. He wanted an audience. He wanted to destroy my professional reputation and strip away my dignity in front of the most powerful people I knew. "Excuse me?" he boomed, his voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. He clapped his hands together loudly, startling a group of executives. "Let us have some attention, please. I need the on-site manager right now." He looked directly at me, sneering the words "on-site manager" as if they were an insult. He was deliberately demoting me from the founder and owner of the estate to a lowly employee in front of my clients. The low hum of corporate conversation died instantly. The tech executives turned around holding their coffee cups, watching the bizarre spectacle unfold. My security director took a step forward to intervene, but I held up my hand and gave a sharp shake of my head. I wanted Chase to speak. I wanted him to hang himself with his own arrogance. I walked slowly toward him, keeping my posture straight and my expression entirely blank. "May I help you, Chase?" I asked. My voice was calm and steady, betraying none of the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Chase let out a loud, condescending laugh. He turned to the tech executive, spreading his arms wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption," he announced smoothly. "Please do not worry about your event. The family trust is officially stepping in to take over operations today. We are under new management." He turned back to me, his eyes flashing with cruel triumph. "Erica, you are being relieved of your duties due to gross incompetence. We are terminating your managerial contract effective immediately. I suggest you go to the back office, pack up your personal belongings, and quietly leave the premises before I have security escort you out." I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink away. "You are making a fool of yourself, Chase," I said quietly. "You have no legal authority to terminate anyone on this property." He stepped right into my physical space, trying to use his height and broad shoulders to intimidate me. He stepped sideways, blocking my path to the main hall, asserting his physical dominance. He was trying to force a messy, emotional scene. He wanted me to yell, to cry, to look like an unstable, hysterical woman who could not handle the pressure of business. "I have absolute authority," he hissed, leaning down so only I could hear. "I told you I was bringing the Boston developers." He gestured grandly to the three men in suits standing a few feet behind him. "These gentlemen are the future of this property. We are closing the deal. Your little historic hotel is going to be bulldozed by the end of the month. We are building the luxury condos. So stop embarrassing yourself in front of these people and get off my land." The three men in suits looked incredibly uncomfortable. They shifted their weight, exchanging confused glances. Chase was completely oblivious to their hesitation. He was too drunk on the idea of $12 million in cash liquidity to read the room. He thought he was putting on a masterful display of corporate dominance. He thought he was proving to these developers that he was a ruthless businessman who could easily clear out any obstacles in their path. I looked past my brother's red, angry face. I locked eyes with the tallest of the three men in suits. He was an older gentleman with silver hair and a very sharp, intelligent gaze. I did not say a word to Chase. I simply looked at the silver-haired man and gave him a very small, knowing nod. Chase completely misinterpreted my silence. He thought he had broken me. He turned back to the developers, a massive, victorious grin stretching across his face. He reached out and grabbed the arm of the silver-haired man, trying to usher him past me toward the banquet hall. "Come on," Wyatt, Chase said loudly, making sure the surrounding clients could hear him. "Let me show you where we are going to break ground for the first condo tower. We can tear down this main hall by next week." Wyatt stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at Chase's hand wrapped around his expensive suit sleeve. An expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust washed over Wyatt's face. He did not just pull his arm away. He violently jerked it back, as if he had just been touched by something diseased. Chase stumbled slightly, completely caught off guard by the physical rejection. "Wyatt, what are you doing?" Chase stammered, his confident smile faltering. Wyatt straightened his suit jacket and looked at Chase with a mixture of pity and severe irritation. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet courtyard. "I am not here to buy this land, Chase." Chase blinked rapidly, looking back and forth between Wyatt and the other two men. "But the letter of intent," he argued, his voice losing its booming resonance. "We discussed the $12 million buyout. You said you were coming here today to finalize the site inspection." "I said I was coming here to conduct a site inspection," Wyatt corrected him sharply. "I never once said I was coming here to buy the property from you." Wyatt stepped around Chase, treating my brother like an irrelevant piece of furniture. He walked directly toward me. His stern expression instantly melted into a warm, professional smile. "I am not a corporate real estate buyer," Chase Wyatt said without looking back. "I am here because my firm is Erica's primary angel investor." Wyatt extended his hand toward me. I reached out and gave it a firm, confident shake. "It is wonderful to finally meet you in person, Wyatt," I said smoothly. "I am so glad you could make it to the summit today." Chase stood frozen on the cobblestone walkway. His mouth hung slightly open. His brain was short-circuiting as he stared at me and Wyatt shaking hands. He had brought the very men he thought were his saviors directly to my doorstep, only to realize they belonged to me. Wyatt turned his head slightly to address my paralyzed brother. "Erica pitched this business to my venture capital firm 3 years ago." Wyatt explained, his tone utterly ruthless. "We hold the primary commercial paper on the multi-million-dollar renovations. When you called my office last week, desperately trying to sell land you do not even own, I immediately contacted Erica. She suggested we let you bring us out here today so we could see your fraudulent claims firsthand." Chase looked like he was going to be sick. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He looked toward the front gates, where Linda's black SUV was still parked. Even from this distance, I could see the brake lights flash as my mother realized something had gone horribly wrong. You are trespassing on my client's private commercial lease, Wyatt told Chase, stepping closer to him. If you do not remove yourself from this property in the next 30 seconds, I am going to have my legal team file corporate espionage and fraud charges against you before you even reach your truck. Chase did not say another word. The swagger was gone. The arrogance was shattered. He turned around and practically ran down the driveway, fleeing toward my mother's waiting car, leaving his shattered ego and his ruined plans scattered across my flawless gravel. 3 days after my primary investor publicly dismantled my brother in the middle of my courtyard, the desperation of my family reached a fever pitch. They had tried intimidation and failed. They had tried corporate sabotage and failed. Now they were shifting to outright aggressive legal warfare. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the estate was bathed in warm, late afternoon sunlight. I was standing near the entrance of the main manor, reviewing the final floral arrangements for an upcoming society wedding. The atmosphere was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of fountains and birds. That peace was violently interrupted by the screech of tires. My mother's black luxury SUV came tearing up the private drive, ignoring the designated visitor parking entirely. The vehicle lurched to a halt right on the main cobblestone walkway, tires squealing against the stone. The doors flew open and my mother stepped out, flanked by Chase. But this time they were not alone. They had brought a third person with them. He was a stout, sweating man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He clutched a thick metal clipboard to his chest and looked around the property with nervous, darting eyes. I recognized him immediately from the county directory. He was Arthur Miller, the local municipal building inspector. He was also a man who had a well-known reputation around town for making permitting problems disappear if the price was right. It was abundantly clear that my mother had opened her checkbook to buy his services for the afternoon. Chase did not hesitate. He marched directly toward the heavy restored oak doors of the main manor house. He ripped a roll of heavy-duty tape from his pocket and forcefully slapped a bright yellow document right onto the antique wood. He pressed his hand against it, smoothing it out with an aggressive, sweeping motion. It was a formal cease and desist order, paired with an immediate eviction notice. I stood a few feet away, watching them with absolute calm. I did not rush forward to rip the paper down. I simply crossed my arms and waited for the performance to begin. Inspector Miller stepped forward, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He refused to look me in the eye. He looked down at his clipboard and began reading in a loud, shaky voice. Erica Astor, acting as the primary agent of this property, you are hereby ordered to halt all commercial operations immediately. This estate is in direct violation of multiple municipal health codes and zoning ordinances. We have reports of unapproved structural changes to the main load-bearing walls, illegal plumbing modifications in the commercial kitchens, and severe fire safety hazards in the guest suites. I stared at the sweating inspector. Every single word he just read was a fabricated lie. I had spent 2 years fighting for every legitimate permit in the county. My contractors were the best in the state, and my safety inspections had passed with flawless scores just 3 months prior. My mother had clearly bribed this man to falsify public records and generate a crisis out of thin air. Therefore, Inspector Miller continued, his voice wavering slightly under my cold gaze. The county is demanding the immediate closure of your limited liability company. You must vacate the premises within 24 hours until a full municipal audit can be conducted. Linda stepped forward, pushing past the inspector. She was wearing her finest pearl necklace and a look of manufactured maternal tragedy. She placed a hand over her heart, playing the role of the devastated, responsible matriarch trying to save her reckless daughter from herself. We tried to warn you, Erica, Linda said loudly, ensuring that my staff members standing nearby could hear her. We tried to tell you that you were in over your head. You have completely endangered the family trust by building all of this illegally. You are operating a hazard. If someone gets hurt on this property, the liability falls back on us. We simply cannot allow you to put your father's legacy at risk because you wanted to play business owner. I did not say a word. I just let her talk. I let her dig the hole deeper. Because of your gross negligence, Linda continued, her voice growing sharper and more venomous. The family trust is legally obligated to intervene. We are stepping in as the supreme asset managers. We are seizing all physical assets on this property immediately. The kitchens, the event pavilions, the furniture, the inventory. Everything will be liquidated by the trust to pay for the municipal damages and fines you have racked up. You leave us no choice, Erica. We are taking the buildings. Chase stepped up beside her, completely unable to hide the ravenous, desperate greed shining in his eyes. He had tasted failure with the corporate developers, and now he was going for the throat. He thought he had me cornered. He thought that by shutting down my daily operations, he would starve me of the cash flow I needed to fight him in court. And do not bother trying to hire a fancy lawyer to stall this, Chase sneered, pointing a finger at me. You do not have the money to fight us anymore. I raised an eyebrow. Is that right, Chase? That is right, he laughed, a harsh, arrogant sound. Because I took a little trip to the bank this morning. I brought a copy of Dad's original trust charter. As a primary trustee, I informed the commercial branch manager that your business operations were under formal investigation for fraud. I told them you were operating on trust land illegally. I had them freeze your primary operating accounts. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a malicious whisper. I redirected all of your upcoming client deposits, Erica. Every single wedding deposit, every corporate retreat retainer, every dollar scheduled to hit your accounts this week has been legally rerouted directly into the family trust's holding account. You are completely broke. You cannot make payroll on Friday. You cannot pay your caterers. You have nothing. It is over. Pack your bags and get off my land. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for my collapse. He wanted to see panic. He wanted to see me break down and beg for access to my own money. He truly believed he had orchestrated a masterstroke of financial warfare. He thought redirecting my deposits was a genius move that would force me into immediate submission. He was completely blind to the massive federal crime he had just committed by tampering with independent commercial bank routing numbers. I looked at the bright yellow eviction notice taped to my front door. I looked at the sweating, corrupt inspector. I looked at my mother, who was practically vibrating with toxic triumph. Finally, I looked at Chase. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply lifted my left wrist and checked the time on my watch. It was exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. Perfect timing. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed a single button on my speed dial. I held the phone to my ear, keeping my eyes locked dead on my brother. Harrison, I said calmly into the receiver, you can step outside now. They are done talking. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Chase frowned, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. What are you talking about, Erica? Who is Harrison? The heavy oak doors of the main tasting room swung open behind them. My lead corporate attorney, Harrison, stepped out into the afternoon sun. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored suit and carrying a slim black leather portfolio. Harrison was a man who charged $1,000 an hour, and he looked every bit the part of a legal executioner. He did not look at Chase or Linda. He walked with terrifying silent purpose directly toward Inspector Miller. Harrison stopped in front of the sweating inspector. He opened his leather portfolio and pulled out a pristine, thick document bearing a prominent, embossed federal seal. He held the document out, forcing the inspector to take it. Inspector Miller Harrison stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried absolute authority. That is a stamped federal injunction issued by the district court not 20 minutes ago. It explicitly prohibits you, this municipality, and the Astor Family Trust from placing any notices, liens, or eviction orders on these physical structures. The inspector looked down at the federal seal, his face draining of all color. He began to physically shake. Chase lunged forward, his face red with sudden blinding rage. "You cannot do this!" he screamed, pointing at Harrison. "This is family land. The trust owns this dirt. We have the right to evict her and seize the buildings to cover her debts. We are taking the assets." Harrison slowly turned his head to look at Chase. He looked at my brother with the kind of cold, clinical detachment one might use to view a crushed insect. "You cannot evict the buildings," Chase Harrison stated softly, his words cutting through the courtyard like a scalpel. "Because the trust does not own them. Own." Chase stood frozen, his chest heaving as the echo of his own hysterical confession bounced off the cedar walls of my office. He had just admitted to a multi-million-dollar federal felony in front of a primary witness and a corporate attorney. He realized his mistake the exact second the words left his mouth. His jaw snapped shut, his eyes widening in absolute terror as he stared at the crisp, crumpled $1 bill in his fist. Linda grabbed his arm, her manicured fingers digging into his suit jacket. "Chase, what did you just say?" she demanded, her voice shrill and breathless. "What private bridge loan? What forged appraisal?" Chase yanked his arm away, stumbling backward toward the heavy oak doors. "Shut up, Mom!" he barked, his voice cracking with panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face slick with sweat. "This is not over, Erica. I will take you to court. I will tear up that lease. You are not going to steal the family legacy from me." I did not move. I did not blink. I simply reached over and tapped the face of my smartphone resting on the mahogany desk. The screen lit up, clearly displaying the active voice recording app. "Actually, Chase, I think it is over," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "You just confessed to using a fraudulent appraisal of assets you do not own to secure a massive, unregulated bridge loan. You just admitted to institutional bank fraud, and you did it on tape." Chase stared at the glowing phone screen. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a cheap suit. He backed away, his hands raised defensively, shaking his head in a frantic, jerky motion. He bumped into the doorframe, turned, and bolted down the hallway. Linda let out a strangled sob, looking at me with absolute horror before turning and running out the door after him. Harrison calmly closed his black leather portfolio. He adjusted his cuffs and looked at me with a faint, grim smile. "Well," Harrison said, his baritone voice smooth and unaffected, "that certainly expedites our timeline." I picked up the phone, saved the audio file to 3 separate secure cloud servers, and stood up from the desk. "We are not waiting for them to file a baseless lawsuit, Harrison. They are going to scramble. Chase is going to try to liquidate whatever assets he has left to cover his tracks and flee the creditors he just defrauded. We strike right now." I walked out of the office and into the grand foyer. Through the tall glass windows, I watched Linda's black SUV tear down the cobblestone driveway, speeding toward the front gates in a frantic retreat. They were broken, terrified, and completely cornered. But I was not going to let them simply run away. They had tried to destroy my business. They had tried to bulldoze my life's work. They had illegally redirected my client deposits to starve me out. It was time to completely dismantle them. Harrison followed me into the courtyard. "What are your exact instructions, Erica?" he asked, pulling out his phone. "Call the commercial branch manager who froze my operating accounts," I instructed, my voice crisp and authoritative. "Inform them that the family trust utilized fraudulent pretenses to redirect corporate funds from an independent LLC. Tell them if my accounts are not unfrozen and my deposits are not routed back into my control within 1 hour, we are filing a federal injunction against the bank for complicity in wire fraud." Harrison nodded, already dialing the number. "Done. And what about your brother?" "Send the audio recording of his confession directly to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office," I said, looking out over the immaculate sunlit estate I had built with my own 2 hands. "And copy the fraud division of the IRS. If Chase wants to play high-level financial strategy with private bridge loans, he can explain his portfolio to the federal government." 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from my primary commercial bank. The freeze on my accounts had been lifted, and the rerouted client deposits had been aggressively clawed back from the family trust and deposited safely into my LLC's ledger. The bank manager had panicked the moment Harrison uttered the words, "complicity in wire fraud." My payroll was secure, my vendors would be paid, my empire was entirely untouchable. By the following morning, the reality of Chase's catastrophic financial crimes hit the public record. The Manhattan creditors he had defrauded caught wind of the failed corporate takeover at my estate. They realized the $12 million collateral he had promised them was a complete ghost. Chase had forged the appraisal documents, inflating the value of the land and falsely claiming ownership of my physical buildings to secure a massive cash loan to cover his cryptocurrency debts. The fallout was spectacular and immediate. I stood in the main tasting room pouring a cup of artisanal coffee when my tablet chimed with a breaking news alert from a major financial blog. The headline read, "Manhattan heir accused of multi-million-dollar fraud. Creditors seize luxury penthouse." I tapped the screen and read the brief article. Chase's creditors had moved with terrifying speed. They had executed an emergency asset seizure. The $4 million luxury apartment my father had left him, the golden crown jewel of his unearned legacy, had been seized and padlocked by the bank. Chase was officially locked out on the street. His luxury cars were repossessed. His bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators. My phone rang. It was Linda. I let it ring 4 times before calmly pressing the accept button. "Erica, you have to help us." Linda sobbed into the receiver. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was stripped of all the condescension, all the arrogance, and all the performative superiority. She sounded small, terrified, and utterly desperate. "They took the apartment. They took everything. Chase is facing federal charges. You have to release the land. You have to let us sell the estate to pay his bail. Please, you have to save your brother." I looked out the window of the tasting room. I watched my landscaping team meticulously prune the historic rose gardens. I watched a group of tech executives enjoying a catered brunch on the stone terrace. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself down to make Chase look bigger. I had hidden my academic awards. I had worked in the shadows. I had taken a rotting, bankrupt piece of land and turned it into a fortress of wealth, only for them to demand I hand it over on a silver platter. "I am not saving anyone, Mom," I said, my voice absolutely steady. "You wanted the family trust. You wanted the legacy. You have it. The trust owns the dirt. You can go sit on it." "Erica, please," Linda shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You have millions in that LLC. You have the corporate clients. You can pay the creditors. You owe it to this family." "I owe this family absolutely nothing," I replied coldly. Chase made his investments. He invoked his clauses. He dug his own grave, and now you both get to lie in it. Do not ever call this number again. I pressed end. I blocked her contact. I blocked Chase's contact. I walked out onto the stone terrace, the warm morning sun hitting my face. The air smelled of fresh espresso and blooming jasmine. The estate was completely full, the business was thriving, and the heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family history was finally permanently gone. I took a deep breath, smiled at my clients, and went back to work. Harrison let the crisp $1 bill sit untouched on the polished mahogany desk. The ambient noise of the estate seemed to vanish, entirely replaced by the ringing echo of Chase's hysterical confession. I already used the estate's forged $12 million appraisal as collateral for a private bridge loan. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Chase had not just bluffed his way into a pathetic eviction attempt. He had committed textbook federal fraud. Chase stared at the dollar bill, his chest heaving, his face a mask of absolute terror. He realized in real time that his reckless arrogance had finally backed him into an inescapable corner. He had handed a taped confession of bank fraud to a corporate attorney. Without another word, he scrambled backward, knocking over a heavy leather guest chair, and bolted out the double doors of the grand office. His footsteps echoed frantically down the hallway, slipping on the hardwood floors in his rush to escape. Linda sat frozen in the remaining guest chair, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her pristine country club facade cracked completely. For the first time in my 32 years of life, I saw my mother look genuinely afraid. She did not yell at me. She did not deliver a cutting insult about my lack of ambition. She simply scrambled to her feet, abandoning her purse for a moment before snatching it up and running after her golden child. I stood behind my desk looking at Harrison. He calmly adjusted his glasses and packed his stamped injunction back into his briefcase. He did not need to say it. We both knew the reality of a private bridge loan secured by fraudulent collateral. Chase was not dealing with standard commercial banks anymore. He had crossed into the territory of aggressive, unregulated lenders, people who did not send polite collection letters. "I need to know exactly who he owes money to," I told Harrison, my voice low and steady. I need to know how deep this financial rot actually goes. Harrison nodded, tapping a number into his phone. I will call Vance immediately. Vance was a former forensic accountant turned private investigator who specialized in unraveling the financial messes of the ultra-wealthy. He was incredibly discreet and ruthlessly efficient. Within 48 hours, Vance requested an in-person meeting. I arranged for him to come to the estate, entering through the service gate to avoid any unwanted attention from my clients. I led him into my private office and locked the door. Vance did not waste time with pleasantries. He was a tall, lean man who carried a battered leather messenger bag. He opened it and spread a series of printed financial records, bank statements, and property deeds across my mahogany desk. The picture he painted was far darker and more desperate than I could have ever imagined. Your brother did not just lose the Manhattan apartment. Vance began, his voice strictly business. He leveraged it to the absolute hilt to cover margin calls on a catastrophic series of cryptocurrency bets. When the crypto market crashed, he was left holding the bag. The commercial banks foreclosed on the penthouse months ago. But that was not enough to cover his massive deficits. Vance slid a highlighted document toward me. Chase was desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle and hide his failure from his high society circle. So he turned to a shadow lending group out of Miami. They provide high-interest short-term liquidity to wealthy individuals who cannot pass standard banking audits. They operate in a legal gray area, and their collection methods are notoriously aggressive. Chase borrowed heavily from them, promising them a massive return from a supposedly upcoming commercial real estate sale. I stared at the paperwork, the numbers blurring slightly. The $12 million estate buyout, I murmured. He promised them the money from bulldozing my business. Exactly, Vance nodded. But the Miami group demanded immediate physical collateral to secure the bridge loan while the estate sale was finalized. Chase obviously did not have any assets left to his name. So he went to the one person who would never say no to him. Vance slid the final document across the desk. It was a property deed, but the details attached to it made my stomach drop. I recognized the address immediately. It was the sprawling, immaculate Connecticut home where I had grown up. The house where Linda hosted her elite garden clubs, where she displayed Chase's mediocre participation trophies, where she had endlessly criticized my lack of appropriate ambition. The house had been fully paid off by my father decades ago. Your mother signed as the primary guarantor on Chase's bridge loan, Vance stated flatly. 3 months ago, she secretly took out a massive high-interest remortgage on her Connecticut property to stall the shadow creditors and keep Chase out of federal prison. She signed away her entire safety net. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I sank back into my chair, my mind racing. For 3 years, Linda had called me a disappointment. She had mocked my business. She had told her country club friends that I was playing hospitality manager in the woods, while Chase was a financial prodigy. During the family ambush, she had demanded I step aside and let the adults handle the wealth. It was all a desperate, terrified projection. The woman who had sneered at my 16-hour workdays and calloused hands was secretly drowning in her golden son's toxic, escalating debt. She was leveraged to the absolute breaking point. The aggressive eviction attempt with the bribed municipal inspector, the screaming on my front porch, the demands to seize my catering equipment and physical assets. It was not just about basic greed anymore. It was about raw animal survival. If Chase defaults on this bridge loan, Vance explained carefully, gathering his documents, the Miami group will not hesitate. They will execute the lien on your mother's house. They will foreclose on the Connecticut property within 30 days. She will lose everything. She will be homeless. I sat in the quiet of my office, digesting the monumental weight of this information. My mother had gambled her entire existence to protect the illusion of Chase's brilliance, and she had lost everything. They had come to my estate to steal my life's work, simply to plug the gaping hole of their own financial ruin. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was suffocating. I felt a brief, fleeting flash of pity followed immediately by a hardened, absolute resolve. I could not save them from the consequences of their own actions. I had an empire to run. I thanked Vance for his work and saw him out. I needed to shift my focus immediately back to reality. It was Saturday afternoon, and the Astor estate was preparing for its most high-profile event of the season. We were hosting a massive society wedding for the daughter of a prominent state senator. The contract was worth over $250,000 for the weekend alone. Flawless execution was not just expected, it was absolutely mandatory. I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, letting the familiar rhythm of event preparation wash over me. The estate was humming with intense, coordinated activity. My catering team was unloading crates of fresh coastal seafood and organic local produce into the main commercial kitchens. The floral designers were weaving thousands of white orchids and imported roses through the grand wrought iron trellises in the botanical gardens. The lighting technicians were testing the elaborate string lights suspended above the outdoor dance floor. I moved through the property with a tablet in hand, verifying every single detail. I checked the temperature of the wine cellars, ensuring the vintage champagnes were perfectly chilled. I inspected the linens in the bridal suite, running my hands over the custom-embroidered napkins. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. The guests were scheduled to begin arriving in less than 4 hours. The valet team was already setting up their stations at the front gates. I stood on the stone terrace overlooking the manicured lawns, feeling a deep, steady pride in what I had built. Despite the chaos my family had tried to unleash, my business was thriving. The 99-year lease was completely ironclad. The deposits were secure in my accounts. Chase and Linda were powerless to touch me. I pulled my radio from my belt to communicate with my head chef about the appetizer timeline. Just as I pressed the transmission button, a loud mechanical grinding noise echoed from the direction of the main utility building. It was a heavy, violent sound like metal snapping under immense pressure. It was immediately followed by total, absolute silence. The gentle hum of the commercial refrigerators died. The ambient music playing through the courtyard speakers cut off. The cascading water in the marble fountain slowed to a miserable trickle and stopped. I looked toward the main manor house. The massive crystal chandeliers visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows went completely dark. The entire estate lost power. My radio crackled with panicked static. "Erica!" My head chef shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "We just lost everything in the main kitchen. The ovens are down. The walk-in coolers are off. What is happening?" I stood on the terrace staring at the darkened estate. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was not a tripped breaker. We had redundant commercial backup generators designed to kick in automatically within 10 seconds of a grid failure. The generators remained completely silent. This was a deliberate, calculated cut. Someone had physically severed the primary power lines and disabled the backups just hours before a massive society wedding was set to begin. And I knew exactly who was desperate enough to do it. I did not waste a single fraction of a second staring at the darkened estate. Panic is a luxury reserved for people who do not have a contingency plan. I turned on my heel and moved swiftly toward the main courtyard, projecting an aura of absolute impenetrable calm. The atmosphere around me was rapidly deteriorating into sheer pandemonium. The sudden silence of the estate had been quickly replaced by the chaotic symphony of a disaster in motion. Waitstaff stood frozen on the terrace, trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres balanced precariously in their hands. The string quartet, who had been warming up in the gazebo, had stopped playing and were looking around in confusion. From the direction of the main manor, the heavy oak doors burst open. The wedding planner, a high-strung woman who charged exorbitant fees for perfection, came sprinting out onto the cobblestones. She was practically hyperventilating, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a life preserver. Right behind her was the bride. She was the daughter of a prominent state senator, and she looked absolutely devastated. She stood in the doorway in her custom silk gown, tears welling in her eyes, threatening to ruin hours of meticulous makeup artistry. The senator himself emerged a moment later, his face flushed with indignation. He was a man accustomed to seamless execution, and paying $250,000 for a darkened, silent venue was not in his itinerary. He locked eyes with me and began marching down the steps, clearly preparing to deliver a blistering ultimatum. I intercepted him before he could speak a single word. I held up my hand, meeting his furious gaze with a steady, unwavering look. "Senator, I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmur of the frightened staff. We have experienced a momentary grid fluctuation. I guarantee you on my personal and professional reputation that the power will be restored, and your daughter will walk down the aisle exactly on schedule. Please take her back inside and pour her a glass of the vintage champagne I left in the suite. Give me exactly 10 minutes. He stared at me, searching my face for any sign of deception or weakness. Finding none, he gave a curt nod, turned around, and ushered his weeping daughter back into the manor. With the immediate client crisis contained, I broke into a fast, purposeful stride toward the service pathways. Chef Mateo came jogging up beside me, his white apron already stained with prep work. He was wiping sweat from his forehead, his breathing ragged. "Erica, this is a catastrophe," Mateo gasped, struggling to keep pace with me. "We just lost the induction ovens right in the middle of the first course prep. The wok and freezers are sealing in the ambient temperature, but if we do not get power back soon, we are going to lose thousands of dollars in premium seafood. We cannot serve raw scallops to a state senator. We have to call it off. We have to invoke the emergency cancellation protocol." "We are not canceling anything, Mateo," I replied sharply, never breaking my stride. "Get back to the kitchen. Tell your line cooks to prep the cold stations, and be ready to fire the ovens the exact second the current returns." I left him staring after me as I rounded the corner of the maintenance building. The smell hit me before I even reached the door. It was the distinct, acrid stench of burning rubber and scorched copper. The heavy steel door of the primary utility shed was hanging slightly ajar. The heavy-duty industrial padlock I had installed just months ago had been completely obliterated. It lay on the concrete pathway, its hardened steel shackle violently snapped. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dim, hot interior of the shed. The extent of the sabotage was breathtaking in its sheer malice. This was not a random act of vandalism. This was a targeted, professional-grade execution. The massive, thick main conduit cables that fed power from the municipal grid into the estate's distribution panel had been brutally severed. The clean, sharp cuts indicated the use of heavy-duty industrial bolt cutters. The thick copper wiring spilled out of the black rubber casing like the guts of a wounded animal. I immediately looked toward the corner of the room where my standard commercial backup generator was housed. The digital display was dark. I walked over and inspected the machine. The primary fuel line connecting the diesel tank to the engine block had been meticulously crushed and severed. The manual override switch had been smashed with something heavy, likely a hammer. The machine was a useless block of metal. I stood in the sweltering shed, my mind rapidly calculating the legal and financial implications of this exact moment. Chase was terrified. He was backed into a corner by ruthless shadow creditors who were ready to foreclose on Linda's Connecticut mansion. He needed my estate to fall back into the family trust so he could liquidate the physical assets and pay off his bridge loan. But my 99-year lease was bulletproof. The only way to break that lease was if my LLC went bankrupt and defaulted on the annual terms. He had read my vendor contracts. He knew the specific legal clauses tied to hosting high-profile events. If I failed to deliver the senator's wedding tonight, the failure to perform clause would trigger instantly. I would be liable for refunding the entire $250,000 deposit plus punitive damages for ruining the event. The resulting lawsuit would drain my operating accounts. The negative press would destroy my future bookings. My LLC would collapse, the lease would be voided, and Chase would swoop in to claim the buildings. It was a vicious, calculated strike designed to completely annihilate me in a single evening. I stepped back out into the afternoon sunlight, my eyes scanning the ground around the utility shed. We had laid down fresh, soft topsoil earlier that week to prepare for new garden beds. The dirt was damp from the morning sprinklers. Right there, leading directly from the access road to the shattered padlock, was a clear, undeniable set of footprints. I crouched down, examining the impressions in the soft earth. They were deep and distinct, showcasing the unique custom tread of high-end imported Italian leather boots. Chase was so arrogant, so blinded by his own panic, that he had not even bothered to change out of his designer footwear to commit a federal crime. He had stomped right through the mud, leaving a perfect customized signature of his presence at the scene. Mateo came running around the corner again, his face pale with dread. Erica, the wedding planner, is threatening to call the local news outlets, he said, his voice trembling. The guests are going to start arriving at the front gates in exactly 45 minutes. We are dead in the water. It is over. It is not over, I said, standing up and brushing a speck of dirt from my skirt. I walked past the ruined utility shed and headed toward the towering ivy-covered brick wall that separated the maintenance yard from the historic heritage gardens. When I first secured the lease and began renovating the estate, I knew exactly who I was dealing with. I knew my mother and my brother would stop at nothing to undermine my success. I did not just prepare for bad weather or municipal blackouts. I prepared for outright warfare. I reached the brick wall and pushed aside a thick, heavy curtain of climbing ivy. Behind the foliage, seamlessly integrated into the historic masonry, was a heavy iron trellis. I reached through the wrought iron bars, found the concealed biometric scanner, and pressed my thumb against the glass. A soft click echoed from the brickwork. I grabbed the edge of the trellis and pulled. A massive hidden steel door swung outward on silent oiled hinges. Mateo gasped, taking a step back in sheer shock. Inside the concealed concrete bunker sat my true contingency plan. It was a massive military-grade silent diesel generator system. It was completely isolated from the main utility shed, completely off the grid, and fully fueled to run the entire estate at maximum capacity for 72 hours straight. I had paid a fortune to have it installed in absolute secrecy. I stepped into the bunker, grasped the heavy industrial transfer lever, and pulled it down with a resounding metallic clack. The machine roared to life. It was a deep, powerful, vibrating hum that shook the concrete floor beneath my feet. Instantly, the estate surged back from the dead. The massive outdoor string lights blazed into existence, brighter than before. Through the trees, I could hear the cascading rush of the marble fountain starting up again. The ambient courtyard music faded back in smooth and elegant. The crisis had been entirely averted in less than 8 minutes. Mateo stared at the humming machine, his mouth hanging open in silent awe. "Get back to your kitchen, chef," I said, offering him a sharp, victorious smile. "You have a senator to feed." He nodded, frantically turned, and sprinted back toward the manor, shouting orders into his radio. I stepped out of the hidden bunker and locked the steel door behind me, pulling the ivy back into place. I stood alone in the service yard, the low hum of the secret generator, the only sound. I turned and looked back at the ruined utility shed. I let my gaze slowly travel up the wooden siding, past the shattered door, right up to the shadowed eaves just beneath the roofline. Nestled perfectly in the dark wood, completely invisible. Unless you knew exactly where to look, a tiny red light blinked with rhythmic precision. It was a 4K motion-activated night vision security camera, hardwired to upload directly to a secure off-site server. It covered the entire service yard, the dirt pathway, and the door to the shed. It had captured every single second of the vandalism. It had captured Chase's face, his expensive boots, and his heavy bolt cutters. Linda had remortgaged her life to keep her son out of a federal penitentiary, but Chase had just handed me the very footage that was going to put him there. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Harrison's number. The wedding was going to be flawless, and by Monday morning, my brother was going to be in handcuffs. The morning sun cast a brilliant golden glow across the Astor estate, reflecting off the pristine marble fountains that were still running flawlessly. The society wedding had been an absolute triumph. Despite the frantic behind-the-scenes pivot, not a single guest had noticed the transition to the secret backup generators. The state senator had personally shaken my hand before leaving, securing my LLC, a glowing review, and guaranteeing future high-end referrals. My staff had handled the cleanup with their usual military precision, and by 9 in the morning, the grounds looked untouched. I sat at the expansive mahogany desk in my private office, sipping a cup of black coffee. The heavy oak doors were open to the morning breeze. I was waiting. I knew they would not wait long. Sure enough, the familiar crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Linda's black SUV. She did not screech to a halt this time. She parked neatly in a designated visitor spot, playing the role of the dignified matriarch. I watched through the window as she stepped out, wearing a pale cashmere sweater set and a string of pearls. She walked with a deliberate, practiced elegance, her face arranged into a mask of deep maternal concern. She stepped into the grand foyer and made her way directly to my office. "Erica, darling," Linda murmured, hovering in the doorway, as if unsure whether she was welcome. She carried a small artisan pastry box from a bakery downtown. "I brought you some croissants. I know how stressful wedding weekends can be." I did not offer her a seat. I simply watched her, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. Linda shifted her weight, the fake smile faltering just a fraction before she pushed forward and took the guest chair uninvited. She placed the pastry box on the edge of my desk. "I heard there were some terrible complications last night," she said, lowering her voice into a hushed, sympathetic register. "A catastrophic power failure. It must have been an absolute nightmare for you. The rumor mill in town is already spinning, Erica. People are saying the estate's infrastructure is failing. It breaks my heart to see you struggling to keep this place afloat." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Is that what people are saying, Mom? Or is that just what Chase told you after he ran home in a panic?" Linda waved her hand dismissively, entirely ignoring the accusation. "You have tried so hard, sweetheart. We all see that. But this property is simply too much for one person to manage. It requires massive capital structural overhauls and real corporate backing. You are one bad review away from total bankruptcy. The liability alone is keeping me awake at night." She leaned forward, placing her manicured hands flat on the desk. "But we are family, and family protects each other. Chase and I have discussed it extensively. We are willing to step in and save you from the impending fallout. We have drafted a buyout agreement for your LLC. We will absorb your debts, take over your vendor contracts, and give you a generous severance package. You can walk away clean with your reputation intact before this place drags you down completely. You just need to sign the operating rights over to your brother." She looked at me with wide, earnest eyes, playing the role of the benevolent savior to absolute perfection. She was offering me a lifeline made of barbed wire, expecting me to grab it out of sheer terror. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the coaster. "I am not selling the LLC, Linda, and I am certainly not signing anything over to Chase. My business is highly profitable, my infrastructure is perfectly sound, and my 99-year lease remains absolutely untouchable." The maternal warmth vanished from Linda's face as if a switch had been flipped. Her posture rigidified, the lines around her mouth tightening into a vicious sneer. The cashmere and pearls could no longer hide the venomous, desperate woman underneath. She dropped the facade entirely. "You arrogant, ungrateful little girl," Linda hissed, her voice dropping an octave. "You think you hold all the cards because of a piece of paper your father signed when he was not in his right mind? You think you can steal the Astor legacy and leave your brother with nothing?" "I did not steal anything," I replied coldly. "I built a business on ruined land. You and Chase are the ones trying to steal the profits because you failed everywhere else." Linda stood up, leaning over the mahogany desk, her eyes blazing with a toxic, manic energy. "I am giving you one last chance to do this the easy way, Erica. If you do not sign that LLC over to Chase today, I will absolutely destroy you. I will go directly to the local press. I will call every single one of your high-end corporate clients. I will tell them exactly how you managed to secure that ironclad lease." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my unyielding gaze. "And what exactly are you going to tell them?" "I will tell them the truth," she spat, her voice trembling with malicious triumph. "I will tell them that you are a predator. I will tell them that you committed elder abuse. I will say that you isolated your dying father, manipulated him while he was heavily medicated, and forced him to sign away the family trust's most valuable asset. I will paint you as a scheming, abusive daughter who took advantage of a sick old man on his deathbed." She paced behind the guest chair, her hands gesturing wildly as she spun her fabricated narrative. "Do you know how the public reacts to elder abuse, Erica? Do you know what happens to a luxury hospitality brand when the founder is tied to a scandal of that magnitude? The state senator will demand his money back. Your corporate retreats will cancel instantly. You will be toxic." She stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger at me. And we will not just stop at the press. We will file a massive civil lawsuit to invalidate the lease based on predatory coercion. I will drag you through years of agonizing, brutal litigation. I will hire the most vicious attorneys in the state, and I will bleed your operating accounts dry with legal fees. You will not be able to afford payroll, let alone a defense team. I will bankrupt you, Erica. I will take this estate, and I will make sure you are left with absolutely nothing. Sign the papers to Chase right now. She stood there, chest heaving, waiting for my collapse. She expected tears. She expected me to beg for mercy. She expected the same frightened, compliant daughter she had bullied for decades. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I smoothly opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the desk and looked up at her. "You are right about one thing, Mom," I said, my tone clinical and detached. "The liability in this family is absolutely terrifying, but it does not belong to me." I placed my hand on the folder and slowly slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it rested right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. Linda stared at the folder, a flicker of confusion breaking through her rage. She hesitated, her eyes darting from the manila envelope to my face, before she finally reached down and flipped it open. The first page was a massive, high-resolution 4K color photograph. It was a perfect, crystal-clear image of Chase standing outside my primary utility shed in the dead of night. His face was fully illuminated by the ambient security lighting. He was wearing his expensive Italian leather boots, and he was holding a massive pair of industrial bolt cutters directly over my main power conduit. The timestamp in the corner proved he had severed the lines exactly 2 hours before the wedding commenced. Linda let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She quickly flipped to the next page. It was another angle of Chase, clearly showing him smashing the generator override switch with a hammer. She began to physically shake. Her fingers fumbled as she turned to the third document in the stack. This one was not a photograph. It was a thick forensic accounting report generated by Vance. The top page displayed the unmistakable seal of the Shadow Lending Group out of Miami. Attached to it was the promissory note for Chase's unregulated bridge loan. And right beneath that was the undeniable proof of Linda's own fatal mistake. It was the remortgage paperwork for her Connecticut mansion. It detailed exactly how she had fraudulently leveraged a fully paid-off property to secure a high-risk illicit cash injection to cover her son's catastrophic cryptocurrency debts. Every routing number, every forged appraisal, every single piece of toxic debt was laid bare in black and white. Linda's hands spasmed. The paper slipped from her grasp, scattering across the top of my desk. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, pallid gray. Her mouth opened, but she could not draw enough breath to form a single word. The illusion of her wealth, her power, and her control had just evaporated into thin air. She was staring at absolute, undeniable proof of a federal conspiracy, wire fraud, property vandalism, and institutional banking crimes. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I watched my mother tremble, feeling a profound, absolute calm settle over my entire being. "Go to the press, Mom," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the air in the room. "Tell them whatever fabricated stories you want. Go to my clients. File your baseless lawsuits. Do exactly what you just threatened to do." I paused, letting the silence stretch, making sure she heard every single syllable of my next sentence. "Go to the press, Mom. I will go to the FBI." Linda collapsed into the guest chair, her knees giving out completely. She stared at the scattered evidence, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The game was over. The trap she had tried to set for me had snapped shut on her own neck. Linda did not speak another word. She gathered her ruined dignity, clutched her designer handbag, and walked out of my office like a hollow shell of the woman who had entered just 20 minutes prior. I watched her vehicle retreat down the driveway, knowing the real storm was only just beginning to gather. The crushing reality of the Miami creditors was not something that could be ignored, negotiated, or wished away with a maternal scolding. These were not municipal clerks or polite bank managers. They were ruthless operators, who dealt in hard consequences. And by Thursday evening, those consequences had finally arrived at my brother's doorstep. According to Vance, who had kept a quiet, steady tail on Chase's movements, the shadow lenders had grown tired of waiting. They had sent 2 men to intercept Chase outside a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, where he had been hiding since the seizure of his penthouse. The details Vance relayed were chilling. There was no formal paperwork served. There was only a brief, violent physical altercation in the parking lot, and a definitive ultimatum delivered directly to Chase's fractured jaw. He was given 48 hours to produce the millions he owed, or the creditors would not just take Linda's Connecticut mansion, they would ensure Chase was never found again. Fear has a unique way of stripping a person down to their absolute most primal instincts. For a man like Chase, who had spent his entire life insulated by inherited wealth and unearned privilege, the sudden introduction of genuine life-threatening violence broke his mind completely. He could no longer rely on his mother's checkbook. He could no longer hide behind the Astor family name. He needed pure, untraceable liquid cash, and he needed it immediately to flee the country. It was shortly after 2 a.m. on a moonless Friday night when the silent perimeter alarms on my smartphone began to vibrate. I was wide awake in my private suite on the 3rd floor of the renovated carriage house, reviewing a catering contract under the soft glow of a desk lamp. The estate was cloaked in absolute silence, the grounds wrapped in the heavy, undisturbed darkness of rural isolation. When the notification flashed across my screen, I did not panic. I simply set down my pen, picked up my phone, and tapped into the encrypted security network I had installed months ago. The high-definition night vision cameras fed directly to my screen, bathing the dark exterior of the estate in a crisp, monochromatic green glow. A figure was moving through the heavy brush near the eastern edge of the property, entirely bypassing the main gates. He was moving erratically, stumbling over tree roots and tearing through the manicured hedges with a clumsy, desperate urgency. He wore dark clothes and a pulled-up hood, but the gait was unmistakable. It was Chase. He had managed to evade the outer motion sensors because he knew the old layout of the land from our childhood. He clearly thought the security system had not been upgraded since our father was alive. He hugged the stone wall of the main administrative building, sliding along the shadows, until he reached the rear exterior of my private back office. I watched him pause, his chest heaving violently, his breath pluming in the cold night air. He looked over his shoulder, a paranoid hunted animal jumping at every rustle of the wind. He pulled a heavy metal crowbar from his duffel bag. With a violent, reckless swing, Chase smashed the heavy iron bar directly into the reinforced glass pane of my office window. The glass did not shatter, completely held together by the security film I had applied, but a massive spiderweb of cracks spidered across the surface. He struck it again, and then a 3rd time until the frame buckled and the glass gave way with a sickening crunch. He reached through the jagged opening, unlatched the heavy brass lock, and tumbled clumsily into the darkness of my office. My thumb hovered directly over the red digital panic button on my screen. One tap would trigger a deafening 120 decibel siren across the entire property. One tap would instantly dispatch the local police and my private armed security detail. I could have him pinned to the floor in handcuffs in less than 5 minutes. I stared at the glowing red button. My pulse thrummed a slow, steady rhythm in my ears. I did not press it. I pulled my thumb back, letting my hand rest flat against the cool surface of my desk. I kept my eyes locked on the live feed. Chase scrambled into the center of my office, clicking on a small, blindingly bright tactical flashlight. The beam swept frantically across the room, illuminating my filing cabinets, the architectural blueprints spread across the drafting table, and finally settling exactly where I knew it would. He locked the beam onto the tall, humming black tower mounted securely in the corner of the room. It was the estate's primary server rack. In the hospitality industry, a venue is only as valuable as its proprietary data. That server held the absolute lifeblood of my entire corporation. It contained the unencrypted high-value client lists of every corporate executive, politician, and celebrity who had booked the estate. It held the direct financial routing numbers for our commercial accounts. It contained the exclusive, heavily negotiated vendor contracts that gave my business its competitive edge. To a rival hospitality group looking to crush their competition, that data was worth its weight in gold. Chase knew this. He had grown up around the business long enough to understand that physical assets could be tied up in litigation, but raw data could be sold on the black market in an instant. He intended to rip the servers from the wall drive straight to my biggest corporate competitor in the neighboring county and sell the entire digital infrastructure of my empire for a fraction of its true value. He just needed enough cash to buy a fake passport and disappear to an extradition-free country before the Miami creditors caught up with him. I watched him drop the crowbar and rip his duffel bag open. He was muttering to himself, his voice caught on the high-sensitivity audio feed. The words were a frantic, disjointed stream of panic. "Just get the drives," he panted, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled with the metal casing. "Get the drives, get the cash, get out. They are going to kill me. I have to get out." He did not bother trying to carefully extract the data drives. He was too terrified, too completely consumed by the adrenaline of his own survival. He grabbed the main server chassis and yanked it backward with brute animal force. The heavy mounting brackets groaned and snapped. Thick bundles of Ethernet cables and power cords ripped from their sockets, sparking briefly as the heavy unit tore free from the wall. Chase grunted, the heavy metal box crushing against his chest as he shoved it clumsily into his duffel bag. He was sweating profusely, his eyes wide and unblinking, his entire body vibrating with raw, unfiltered terror. He zipped the bag shut, hoisted it over his shoulder, and turned back toward the shattered window. He paused for a single second, shining his flashlight around the room one last time to ensure he had not left any obvious tools behind. The beam of light passed directly over the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling, completely missing the microscopic pinhole lens of the secondary camera, tracking his every move. I sat in the quiet, serene comfort of my suite, drinking in the sight of my brother committing a brazen, undeniable corporate burglary. He thought he had just secured his salvation. He thought he had outsmarted me, bypassed my security, and stolen the absolute core of my livelihood. He was completely, blissfully unaware that he was playing a role in a script I had written days ago. He hoisted the bag, climbed back through the jagged window frame, and disappeared into the tree line, sprinting back toward the highway with the stolen server bouncing against his spine. I watched the green glow of the perimeter cameras track his retreat until he vanished completely into the night. I gently locked my phone screen and set it down on the desk. I did not call the police. I did not sound the alarm. I simply reached over, turned off my desk lamp, and allowed myself a slow, genuine smile in the darkness. He had taken the exact bait I wanted him to take. The crisp morning air filtering through the shattered window of my private office was a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension of the previous night. I stood in the center of the room with a steaming cup of coffee in my hand, calmly surveying the damage. The floor was covered in a glittering carpet of reinforced safety glass. The heavy wall mounts where the primary server chassis had once rested were twisted and mangled, the severed Ethernet cables hanging limply like dead vines against the plaster. Wyatt strode through the doorway a moment later. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from the broken window to the empty space on the wall, and finally to me. He had received the automated security alert on his phone the second the glass had broken, but my strict override command had instructed him to stand down and keep the perimeter guards away from the administrative building. He was a man who preferred action, and standing by while the estate was breached had clearly grated on his nerves. "I do not understand this strategy," Erica Wyatt stated flatly, his boots crunching slightly on the broken glass as he moved into the room. "A physical breach of the main office is a worst-case scenario. He took the primary hardware. He has our entire operational blueprint. Why did you lock me out of the response protocol? We could have had him pinned to the floor before he even got his hands on the chassis." "Because a caught burglar is just a desperate man with a crowbar," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "A trespassing charge is a local misdemeanor. Chase would post bail by noon, and Linda would immediately spin it to the press as a tragic misunderstanding involving a troubled family member. She would use the sympathy to bolster her own narrative. I do not want Chase arrested for breaking a window, Wyatt. I want him permanently removed from my life." Wyatt frowned, crossing his arms over his broad chest. You let him walk away with the client lists. You let him take the vendor routing numbers. I did not let him take anything of value, I said, setting my mug down on the edge of the intact drafting table. Before Wyatt could question me further, Marcus stepped into the office. Marcus was my chief of IT security, a brilliant, quiet man who treated digital infrastructure with the kind of reverence most people reserved for religion. He was carrying a heavy, reinforced black Pelican case. He did not spare a single glance for the broken window or the mangled wall mounts. He walked directly to my desk, unlatched the case, and pulled out a high-powered tactical laptop. Did he take the bait? Marcus asked, his voice entirely devoid of panic, as he connected a series of cables to a secure standalone power supply. He took it hook, line, and sinker, I replied. Marcus allowed a faint, grim smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He booted up the laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced, terrifying speed. I turned back to Wyatt, who was watching the exchange with growing comprehension. 2 weeks ago, when Vance confirmed the existence of Chase's unregulated bridge loan with the Miami shadow creditors, I knew my brother would eventually reach a breaking point. I explained. Those lenders do not send polite collection notices. They send enforcers. They gave Chase an ultimatum, and he realized that Linda's fraudulent remortgage on the Connecticut house was not going to provide the liquid cash he needed to save his own skin. He needed millions, and he needed it in untraceable offshore capital. Wyatt nodded slowly. He came for the data. He wants to sell our client infrastructure to a rival hospitality group. Exactly, I said. But the server he ripped off that wall was entirely hollow. Marcus migrated our actual operating systems, the real client lists, and the genuine financial routing numbers to a multi-factor authenticated encrypted cloud server over a month ago. The physical tower Chase stole was a dummy box. It was a digital honeypot. Marcus tapped the enter key with a sharp clack. It is a masterpiece of deception, he said, his eyes locked on his monitor. If you plug that server into a power source and boot up the drives, it looks exactly like the central nervous system of a multi-million-dollar corporation. The file directories are perfectly labeled. Astor-Fee, IP clients. Vendor contracts 2025. Escrow routing numbers. It looks like an absolute goldmine to a desperate man looking for leverage. But it is not data, Wyatt realized, the pieces finally clicking together. It is a weapon, I confirmed. The moment Chase powers up that drive and clicks on a single file, he executes a hidden payload. The drive is loaded with a military-grade remote access Trojan or a RAT. The malware is completely silent. It will bypass his local firewalls, disable his antivirus software without triggering a single alert, and grant Marcus total administrative access to Chase's machine. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching lines of code scroll rapidly across his screen. It does not just stop there, Marcus added. The software is designed to instantly mirror his desktop. We will see everything he sees in real time. It will log every keystroke capture, every password he types, and record the exact hidden IP addresses he attempts to route his traffic through. He thinks he stole a treasure chest, but he actually just carried a tracking beacon directly into his own safe house. We stood in the quiet office, the ambient morning sounds filtering through the broken window. The trap was set. Now it was just a matter of waiting for a cornered animal to make a fatal mistake. Chase was operating on a ticking clock. He owed millions to men who would not hesitate to resort to extreme physical violence. He had stolen what he believed to be incredibly valuable corporate espionage material. But selling that data to a rival firm would take time. Time he simply did not have. His only immediate play was to use the supposedly stolen data as collateral to stall the Miami group or to access his own hidden illicit funds to buy a fake passport and a one-way ticket out of the country. The silence stretched on for nearly an hour. Wyatt stood by the door, his eyes scanning the tree line, while I remained perfectly still watching Marcus's screen. The tension in the room was thick and metallic. Suddenly, the screen on Marcus's tactical laptop flashed bright green. A high-pitched rhythmic ping echoed from the speakers. The terminal window vanished, replaced instantly by a high-resolution live video feed of an unfamiliar computer desktop. The background was a generic default image, but the cursor was moving rapidly across the screen. "He just plugged it in," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The payload executed flawlessly. He has completely compromised his own system. We are in." I stepped closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I watched my brother's digital footprint unfold in real time. The cursor dragged across the screen, clicking open a secure encrypted browser window. He was moving with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. The keystroke logger in the bottom corner of Marcus's screen began to populate with complex alphanumeric passwords as Chase desperately tried to bypass his own security protocols. "He is routing through a virtual private network," Marcus narrated, his fingers hovering over his own keyboard. "He is trying to bounce his signal through a server in Eastern Europe, but it does not matter. The Trojan is inside the machine behind the VPN. We have his true unmasked IP address. He is operating out of a cheap motel just off the interstate 3 miles past the county line." On the mirrored desktop, a banking portal loaded into view. It was not a standard commercial bank. The logo was discreet, the interface Spartan, and highly secure. "Look at the URL," Wyatt said, stepping up beside me. "He is logging into the Cayman accounts to try and wire the non-existent funds." Marcus smiled, capturing the data packets as quickly as Chase generated them. "He is trying to show the shadow lenders proof of collateral. He is pulling up routing numbers that lead directly to the shell corporations Linda used for the mortgage fraud. He is tying the entire conspiracy together in one single session. Every password, every account number, every illicit wire transfer attempt was being recorded in pristine, undeniable detail." Chase was handing us the smoking gun to his own financial execution. I did not hesitate for a single second. I reached past Marcus and tapped a series of commands on the secondary terminal. I highlighted the entire live data stream, packaged the keystroke logs, the offshore account routing numbers, and the mirrored desktop video feed into a highly encrypted secure zip file. I addressed the transfer protocol directly to Harrison's private server. I hit send. The progress bar flashed across the screen, instantly confirming the delivery. Harrison would have the file in his hands in seconds. He was already standing by, preparing to walk the entire package straight into the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Chase thought he had outsmarted us, but he had just broadcast his federal crimes live to a corporate attorney. 48 hours later, the Astor estate was completely transformed into a vision of absolute aristocratic perfection. The autumn air was crisp and clear, holding the faint scent of wood smoke and imported orchids. We were hosting the pinnacle event of the season. It was the annual Heritage Foundation Charity Gala. This was not a standard wedding or a simple corporate retreat. This was the gathering of the region's absolute elite. The guest list was a closely guarded roster of local politicians, wealthy venture capitalists, and high-ranking executives. Among them were several senior partners from the exact investment bank that had unceremoniously fired Chase 2 years prior. The main ballroom of the manor was bathed in the warm golden light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. Waitstaff in immaculate white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. A renowned jazz singer flown in specifically for the evening stood on the elevated stage at the far end of the room, her smooth velvet voice drifting over the low murmur of high society networking. I moved through the room with practiced grace, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and cementing my reputation as the premier hospitality manager in the state. I wore a tailored emerald gown that projected quiet authority. Every detail of the evening was flawless. The floral arrangements were perfectly symmetrical. The lighting was meticulously calibrated. The donations for the charity were already exceeding projections. I was in absolute control. Then the heavy oak double doors at the entrance of the ballroom crashed open with a violent, echoing bang. The sound was like a gunshot in the refined atmosphere of the gala. The low hum of polite conversation died instantly. Heads snapped toward the entrance. Chase stood in the doorway. He looked nothing like the golden child of the Astor family. He looked like a man who had spent the last 48 hours descending into a private, inescapable hell. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and stained with spilled alcohol and dirt. His tie was loosened and hanging askew around his neck. His face was pale and unshaven, covered in a sheen of terrified, exhausted sweat. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting around the room with a frantic, manic energy. He had realized the hard drive was a trap, or perhaps he simply could not unlock it and the shadow creditors from Miami had finally run out of patience. Whatever the specific catalyst was, Chase was entirely out of his mind. He was cornered, drunk, and operating on pure, desperate adrenaline. He did not politely weave through the crowd. He shoved his way forward, stumbling over the hem of a woman's evening gown and knocking a tray of champagne glasses from a waiter's hand. The crystal shattered sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The elite guests recoiled in horror, pulling their spouses close and stepping back to create a wide, terrified path for the deranged man barging into their exclusive sanctuary. I stood near the center of the room, my expression locked into a mask of cold observation. Wyatt immediately moved to intercept him, his hand reaching for the radio on his belt, but I caught his eye and gave a sharp, subtle shake of my head. I needed this to play out. I needed the entire room, especially the executives from his former bank, to witness exactly who Chase Astor truly was. Chase hauled himself up the few steps onto the main stage. The jazz singer took one look at his wild, bloodshot eyes and backed away. Chase lunged forward and snatched the heavy silver microphone right out of her hand. The sudden movement caused the speakers to emit a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback that made several guests wince and cover their ears. "Listen to me," Chase screamed into the microphone. His voice was slurred, thick with alcohol and blind rage, but it echoed deafeningly through the silent ballroom. "You all think she is so perfect. You think Erica is this brilliant business owner. You are all being lied to. She is a fraud. She is a thief." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The state senator standing near the front row lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in deep disapproval. "She stole this estate!" Chase roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. The microphone picked up his ragged, heavy breathing. "She manipulated our dying father. He was sick. He was heavily medicated. He did not know what he was doing. She isolated him from his real family and coerced him into signing that 99-year lease. She stole my legacy. She stole my birthright to play hospitality queen, and she ruined the Astor family name to do it." He paced the stage like a caged animal, his frantic energy spilling over. "She is trying to destroy me. She set me up. She is bankrupting her own mother. You are all funding a predator. She belongs in prison." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, thick and heavy with shock. This was the ultimate social taboo. This was dirty laundry being aired in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. Chase had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was publicly accusing me of elder abuse and fraud in front of my most lucrative clients and investors. Before the shock could fully settle, the crowd parted again. Linda burst through the doors, rushing down the center aisle. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup carefully smudged to suggest hours of weeping. She was wearing a simple dark dress, playing the role of the devastated, victimized matriarch to absolute perfection. "Chase, stop!" Linda cried out, her voice breaking with manufactured sorrow. She scrambled up the stairs to the stage and grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the microphone. She turned to face the crowd, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "I am so sorry," Linda sobbed, pressing a hand to her chest. She looked out at the sea of wealthy, influential faces, projecting complete maternal despair. "My son is just broken. We are all broken. What Erica did to her father, what she did to this family, it has torn us apart. We just want our home back. We just want to heal. Please forgive his outburst. He is just a boy who lost his father to a greedy, ruthless sister." It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She was taking Chase's drunken, unhinged rant and wrapping it in the protective, sympathetic cloak of a grieving mother. She was lending credibility to his insane accusations. She was validating the lie. I watched the faces of my guests. I saw the doubt begin to creep into their eyes. I saw the hesitation. In high society, perception is reality. A rumor of elder abuse, a hint of predatory behavior toward a dying man that was enough to poison a reputation forever. The executives from the bank were whispering to each other. The investors were looking at me with sudden, sharp suspicion. Linda and Chase stood on the stage, clinging to each other, a tragic portrait of a family wronged. They looked down at me, and beneath the tears and the drunken sweat, I saw the exact same thing in both of their eyes. Absolute venomous triumph. They had cornered me in public. They had weaponized my own event against me. They fully expected me to shatter under the weight of the humiliation. They expected me to break down in tears, to scream defensive denials, or to turn and flee the ballroom in absolute shame. They thought they had finally broken my iron control. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not run. I adjusted the cuffs of my emerald gown, my movements smooth and deliberate. The entire room watched in breathless anticipation as I stepped forward. The crowd parted for me automatically, creating a clear, silent path to the front of the room. I walked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound that I could hear the faint, frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every eye was locked on me. The wealthy investors who had praised my business acumen just an hour ago were now waiting to see if they had backed a monster. The politicians who relied on clean optics were calculating their distance. This was the moment that would define the rest of my life. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I felt the smooth wood of the podium beneath my fingertips. I felt the heat of the stage lights on my skin. I felt the sheer desperate panic radiating from the two people standing just inches behind me. They had brought a knife to a gunfight, and they had absolutely no idea that I had already pulled the trigger. I reached the stage and walked up the steps. Linda took a sudden, involuntary step back, her fake tears faltering for a fraction of a second as she saw the absolute void of emotion in my eyes. Chase gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles white, swaying slightly on his feet. I did not look at either of them. I smoothly bypassed my mother and my brother and stepped directly up to the main podium. I reached out and firmly grasped the edges of the polished wood, looking out over the sea of silent, expectant faces. The silence in the grand ballroom was an almost physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Every single face in the crowd was turned toward me, their expressions a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and aristocratic judgment. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. They expected my voice to tremble, my composure to shatter, and my tears to validate the horrific narrative my brother had just screamed into the microphone. I looked down at the tablet resting on the podium shelf. My fingers were perfectly steady. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said. My voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, crystal clear and entirely devoid of panic. It cut through the heavy atmosphere like a scalpel. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to tonight's scheduled programming. My brother is absolutely correct about one thing. Transparency is the absolute foundation of any enduring legacy. And since he has decided to make the internal affairs of the Astor family a matter of public record, it is only fair that we examine the complete, unedited truth together." I picked up the dedicated audio-visual cable resting next to the microphone stand. The technical crew at the back of the room had been instructed hours ago to give me unhindered access to the projection feed exactly at 9 o'clock. I was a few minutes early, but the system was fully primed. I plugged the cable directly into my tablet. Behind me, the massive 20-foot digital projection screens that spanned the entire rear wall of the stage flared to life. The guests blinked, adjusting to the sudden brilliant wash of white light. They expected to see the carefully produced charity montage detailing the Heritage Foundation's recent philanthropic endeavors. Instead, the screens displayed a high-resolution scan of a highly classified, heavily redacted financial contract. The letters were magnified to massive proportions, making the details utterly impossible to ignore. Linda let out a sharp, choked gasp. She lunged forward, her hands grasping empty air as if she could physically tear the image down from the digital screens. Chase stumbled backward, his drunken bravado evaporating instantly. He stared at the massive projection of his own signature, his jaw going completely slack. "What you are looking at is an unregulated promissory note from a shadow lending syndicate based out of Miami," I announced, my voice washing over the stunned crowd. This document details a multi-million-dollar bridge loan secured under highly illegal pretenses. It was taken out by my brother Chase Astor to cover catastrophic losses in offshore cryptocurrency markets. I swiped my finger across the tablet screen. The projected image shifted instantly. Now the massive screens displayed a side-by-side forensic analysis. On the left was the legitimate, legally witnessed signature of our late father. On the right was the signature on the lease transfer documents Chase had attempted to file with the county clerk. The crowd erupted in a wave of hushed, scandalized whispers. The discrepancies in the signatures were highlighted in bright red ink. The forgery was glaring clumsy and entirely undeniable. When the shadow creditors demanded immediate repayment, I continued my gaze sweeping across the front row of the audience. My brother did not come to his family for honest help. He chose to forge our dying father's signature in a desperate attempt to seize control of this estate and liquidate its assets. The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder, shifting from polite shock to genuine outrage. I located the group of senior partners from Chase's former investment bank standing near the caviar station. Their faces were carved from stone. These were men who dealt with federal compliance and regulatory audits daily. They recognized the exact nature of the documents I was displaying. I watched as two of the executives discreetly pulled their smartphones from their tuxedo pockets, their thumbs flying across their screens. I swiped to the next slide. This was the masterpiece. This was the raw, unfiltered data captured by Marcus's digital honeypot just 48 hours ago. The massive screens filled with the live keystroke logs and the mirrored desktop recording of Chase's frantic midnight session. Last night Chase breached the perimeter of this estate, I said, projecting my voice over the rising clamor of the guests. He broke into my private office and stole what he believed was our primary server chassis. He intended to sell our proprietary client lists and vendor contracts to a rival hospitality group to fund his escape from the country. Unfortunately for him, the server he stole was a decoy loaded with advanced tracking software. The screens played the video of Chase's cursor navigating through the encrypted offshore banking portals. The routing numbers for the Cayman Island shell accounts flashed in massive glowing text. The detailed logs of his attempted wire fraud were displayed for every influential investor, politician, and business leader in the county to read. He plugged the stolen drive into his personal laptop and graciously provided my IT security team with a live, real-time broadcast of his attempts to move non-existent funds across international borders. I explained, keeping my tone strictly informational. He committed textbook federal wire fraud, and he broadcast it directly to our secure servers. Chase dropped the silver microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a deafening metallic thud, rolling away until it hit the edge of the podium. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head, staring up at the 20-foot projection of his own digital execution. The alcohol had completely worn off, replaced by the sheer paralyzing terror of a man watching his entire life disintegrate in front of a live audience. Linda was trembling violently. The performance of the grieving, victimized mother had entirely dissolved. She grabbed Chase's shoulder, tugging at his ruined suit jacket, her eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits. She was calculating an escape route, but the dense crowd of high society guests had unconsciously closed ranks, forming an impenetrable human wall of disgust and condemnation. But wire fraud and forgery were apparently not enough, I said, my voice hardening as I prepared to deliver the final strike. I swiped the tablet screen one last time. The massive displays shifted from digital code to the stark green-tinted footage captured by my night vision security cameras. The image was gigantic and flawless. It showed Chase standing outside the main utility shed, his face clearly visible in the security lighting. He was wielding heavy-duty bolt cutters, physically severing the thick copper conduit cables that supplied power to the entire estate. A loud collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The state senator, who was standing near the center of the room, stiffened. His face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He had been at the estate during the power failure. He suddenly realized that his daughter's multi-million-dollar wedding had been placed in direct jeopardy by a malicious, calculated act of sabotage. The realization rippled through the crowd as other guests connected the dots. Chase had not just committed white-collar crimes. He had endangered hundreds of people to create a distraction. Wyatt and his security team moved seamlessly from the edges of the room, forming a quiet, highly trained perimeter around the base of the stage. They did not draw weapons, but their physical presence was an absolute, undeniable barrier. There would be no frantic escape through the kitchens. There would be no slipping out the back doors. Linda turned toward me, her face a mask of absolute, unadulterated panic. "Erica, please." She begged, her voice a raw, desperate hiss that only I could hear over the rising noise of the ballroom. "Turn it off. Turn it off right now. You are destroying us. You are destroying your own family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no lingering sense of daughterly obligation. The woman standing below me had been willing to watch me burn to protect a criminal. "I am protecting my business, Linda," I replied, my voice carrying no more emotion than a machine. Chase remained on his knees, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the frozen image of himself holding the bolt cutters. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving rapidly as the reality of his situation crushed whatever remained of his arrogance. Then the ambient lighting in the ballroom seemed to shift. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows that lined the grand hall, brilliant alternating flashes of red and blue light began to pierce the darkness of the estate grounds. The rhythmic strobing colors painted the faces of the wealthy guests in harsh, chaotic hues. The heavy murmur of the crowd fell away into an absolute, breathless silence. The only sound was the distant approaching wail of sirens cutting through the crisp autumn air. From the main foyer, the sound of heavy synchronized footsteps echoed sharply against the marble flooring. The grand double doors of the ballroom were pulled wide open by Wyatt's security team. They were not local police responding to a noise complaint or a simple trespassing violation. A team of federal agents in tactical windbreakers strode through the entrance, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, cutting a straight path through the parted crowd, their eyes locked directly on the stage. The lead federal agent was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gaze as hard as slate. He did not pause to address the room or acknowledge the sheer wealth and influence gathered in the ballroom. He marched directly up the center steps of the stage, followed closely by 3 heavily armed agents wearing tactical gear that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding tuxedos and evening gowns. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, shrinking back from the reality of federal law enforcement invading their pristine sanctuary. "Chase Astor," the agent stated, his voice, a flat, booming baritone that required no microphone. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the destruction of critical infrastructure." Chase did not run. He did not fight. The absolute certainty of the digital evidence projected 20 feet high behind him had drained every ounce of fight from his body. He stood frozen, swaying slightly on his feet, as the lead agent grabbed his shoulder, spun him around roughly, and forced his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly across the silent ballroom. It was the definitive sound of a legacy ending. I looked past the stage, focusing my attention on the elite guests who had just witnessed the complete destruction of my brother. The executives from his former investment bank were not looking at him with pity. They were looking at him with the cold, absolute disgust reserved for a liability. One of the senior partners, a man who had once mentored Chase and championed his early career, simply shook his head, turned his back, and signaled for his wife to get her coat. The venture capitalists and local politicians mirrored the gesture, stepping away from the center aisle to avoid any proximity to the disgraced heir. In high society, failure is a contagious disease, and Chase was now patient zero. The agents turned Chase toward the exit. They marched him down the stage stairs and straight down the center aisle. He looked like a hollow shell, his chin resting on his chest, unable to meet the eyes of the people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. Wyatt and his private security team moved in perfect synchronization, stepping forward to clear a wide path through the remaining guests. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers parked outside bathed Chase's pale, sweaty face in alternating colors as he was paraded out the grand double doors and into the cold autumn night. For a long moment, the ballroom remained trapped in a stunned, breathless vacuum. The only sound was the low hum of the projector above us. Then a raw, piercing shriek shattered the silence. Linda lunged forward. The calculated, elegant performance of the victimized matriarch vanished entirely. There was no more manufactured grace. There was no more dignified sorrow designed to solicit sympathy. There was only the raw, visceral panic of a mother watching her golden child face actual, unavoidable consequences for the first time in his sheltered life. She screamed his name, her voice tearing at her throat, but Wyatt had anticipated the reaction. He stepped directly into her path. He formed an impenetrable wall of muscle and dark fabric, gently but firmly blocking her path to the exit. She battered her fists against Wyatt's broad chest, kicking at his shins, but he did not move a single inch. Realizing she could not physically reach her son, Linda whirled around to face me. Her eyes were wild, her expensive mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She stumbled across the wooden floor of the stage and collapsed directly in front of the main podium. She dropped heavily to her knees. The rich, dark fabric of her designer gown pooled around her on the floor, snagging on a rogue piece of audio wire. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and grabbed the emerald silk of my dress, pulling at the fabric with a frantic, clawing grip. "Erica?" she sobbed, the sound completely unhinged echoing through the microphone I still stood near. "You have to stop them. You have to fix this right now. Call your lawyer. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them he had your permission to access the server." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel entirely invisible. She was not crying for the fact that my physical safety had been threatened. She was not crying for the fact that my business had been sabotaged, or that my hard work had nearly been destroyed by the very man she was trying to protect. She was crying because the son who had caused all of it was finally facing the justice he deserved. "I cannot stop federal authorities from prosecuting wire fraud." "Linda," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying calm. "I did not make him steal. I did not make him forge a signature. I simply stopped protecting him from himself." Linda shook her head violently, her hands tightening their grip on my dress. "No, you set him up. You put that tracking software on the drive. You knew he was desperate. You trapped him. You did this on purpose." He broke into my office with a crowbar. I corrected her, my tone unwavering and loud enough for the front rows to hear. "He chose to take the drive. He chose to log into offshore accounts to pay back shadow lenders. Every single choice that led him to those handcuffs was his own." She was hyperventilating, now the reality of the situation finally crashing through her decades of deep, willful denial. "You have to sell this place," she shrieked, her voice cracking as it echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. "Sell the LLC. Liquidate the estate immediately. We need the money for his bail. We need the best defense attorneys in the country. He is your brother. He is family. You have to use the company money to save him." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Even after watching him attempt to sell my entire corporate infrastructure to the highest bidder, even after seeing the undeniable proof of his crimes projected on a 20-foot screen, her first instinct was to demand that I sacrifice my entire empire to shield him from the fallout. She still viewed me exactly as she always had. I was not a daughter with a life and a legacy of my own. I was a resource. I was a safety net meant to be burned to keep Chase warm. "I am your mother," Linda sobbed, burying her face against her hands as she clung to my knees. "He is your brother. You owe us. You have to save him." I looked out over the ballroom. The guests were watching in captivated, stunned silence. Nobody moved toward the buffet. Nobody reached for a glass of champagne. They were witnessing the total, catastrophic collapse of a prominent family dynasty, and they could not look away. I felt the weight of their stares, but it did not intimidate me. I had survived years of Linda's silent judgments and Chase's arrogant dismissals. This public spectacle was nothing compared to the quiet, suffocating years I had spent building my life in their shadows. I reached down and firmly grasped Linda's wrists. Her skin was cold and clammy, slick with panic sweat. With a smooth, unyielding motion, I pried her fingers off the fabric of my emerald gown. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, waiting for the familiar submission she had always extracted from me. She waited for the daughter who always backed down to concede to her tears. I did not concede. I crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. The stage lights beat down on us, casting sharp shadows across her tear-stained face. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting the absolute finality of the moment settle between us like a physical weight. I leaned in close, ensuring that my next words were meant for her ears alone, stripping away the public performance she had relied on her entire life. You sold your daughter out to save a son who bankrupted you. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your bags and leave my property forever. Exactly 30 days later, the once impenetrable fortress of the Astor family legacy officially crumbled into dust. The fallout from the charity gala was absolute and unforgiving. When the federal agents escorted Chase out of my ballroom in handcuffs, they did not just arrest a man. They detonated a financial bomb that leveled everything my mother and brother had spent their lives trying to protect. Chase was denied bail. The flight risk was deemed too high, and the digital evidence Marcus had neatly packaged for the FBI was so overwhelmingly comprehensive that even the most expensive defense attorneys in the state refused to touch the case without a massive upfront cash retainer. A retainer that simply no longer existed. The Miami shadow creditors did not wait for the justice system to run its course. They immediately called in their markers. When they discovered that Chase had effectively incinerated his own collateral and exposed their routing numbers to federal authorities, they moved with ruthless efficiency. They seized every liquid asset tied to Chase's name. But it was not enough to cover the staggering debt he had accumulated. The liability bled upward, instantly infecting the Astor family trust. The trust had co-signed on Chase's initial bridge loans, a desperate measure Linda had authorized behind closed doors to keep her golden boy afloat. Now that toxic debt dragged the entire financial structure underwater. Unable to service the massive compounding interest of the fraudulent loans, the Astor family trust was forced to officially file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The descent was rapid and brutal. The illusion of inherited wealth was stripped away, revealing a hollow core of reckless spending and catastrophic arrogance. Linda's own reality fractured right alongside it. The bank, alerted to the fraudulent remortgage scheme she had attempted on her Connecticut mansion, initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. She was given 30 days to vacate the premises. The bankruptcy court mandated a complete and total liquidation of the trust's remaining assets to satisfy the swarm of angry creditors. By the end of the month, the accountants and federal trustees realized a stark, undeniable truth. The trust was entirely empty. The investment portfolios had been drained. The offshore accounts had been frozen or seized. There was exactly one asset left to liquidate. It was the dirt underneath my estate, the physical acres of land that the Astor family had owned for generations. The auction took place on a dreary, rain-soaked Tuesday morning in a sterile, windowless courtroom in downtown Manhattan. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the proceedings. It was a humiliating arena for the final collapse of an aristocracy. I sat in the very back row of the gallery, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my expression perfectly neutral. I did not want a front row seat. I wanted to observe the entire ecosystem of the room. Linda arrived 10 minutes before the proceedings began. The transformation in her appearance over the last 30 days was staggering. The polished, untouchable matriarch who had commanded charity galas and country club luncheons was completely gone. She looked aged, hollowed out, and consumed by a frantic, vibrating panic. Her designer clothes hung loosely on her frame, and the dark circles under her eyes could not be concealed by makeup. She took a seat near the front, her hands clutching a leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. She was banking her entire survival on this single morning. In her desperate, frantic mind, the land beneath the Astor estate was prime, highly coveted real estate. She was waiting for a massive bidding war. She fully expected a consortium of major commercial developers to fight over the acreage, driving the price into the tens of millions. She believed that the sheer value of the land would satisfy the creditors' payoff Chase's staggering legal fees and leave her with a comfortable multi-million-dollar settlement to start over. She was clutching onto this fantasy like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. The room was indeed filled with aggressive, deep-pocketed real estate developers. Men and women in expensive suits sat with their lawyers holding glossy brochures and property appraisals. Linda looked back at them, a faint, desperate glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes. She thought they were her salvation. At precisely 10 o'clock, the federal bankruptcy trustee stepped up to the podium. He was a dry, humorless man who viewed the destruction of family empires as a matter of simple arithmetic. He called the room to order and officially opened the auction for the primary asset of the Astor Family Trust, the multi-acre parcel of land located in the Hudson Valley. "We will begin the bidding at $5 million, the trustee announced, his voice echoing flatly across the silent courtroom. Linda sat up straighter, her breath catching in her throat. She looked eagerly toward the developers, waiting for the paddles to rise. She waited for the frenzy to begin. But before a single bid could be placed, the trustee adjusted his glasses and looked down at a thick, heavily stamped legal document resting on his podium. "Before we proceed, I am legally obligated to read the encumbrance disclosures associated with this property." The trustee stated, his tone thoroughly bored. "Interested parties must be made aware that the land in question is currently bound by an active 99-year commercial lease. This lease grants exclusive, unrestricted operational, developmental, and financial rights to the existing tenant, an independent hospitality corporation. The terms of the lease explicitly prohibit the landowner from altering, developing, selling, or interfering with the commercial operations on the property for the duration of the 99-year term. Furthermore, the lease rate was prepaid in full prior to the execution of the contract." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. It was like watching all the oxygen get sucked out of a sealed vault. The aggressive real estate developers who had flown in to secure prime Hudson Valley acreage suddenly froze. They leaned over, whispering frantically to their respective attorneys. The lawyers shook their heads, their expressions grim and definitive. The realization rippled through the gallery with devastating clarity. The land was completely and utterly useless to them. If a developer purchased the dirt, they would simply be inheriting a massive tax liability. They could not build condominiums. They could not tear down the manor. They could not collect a single cent of rent from the highly profitable hospitality business operating on top of it. They would be paying millions of dollars to own dirt they could not touch for a century, while my corporation reaped every single financial benefit. I had not just leased the property, I had effectively poisoned the land for anyone but myself. "Do we have an opening bid of $5 million?" the trustee asked, looking out over the room. Absolute suffocating silence answered him. Linda whipped her head around, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She looked at the developers. One of the lead investors simply stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom. Within 60 seconds, 3 other development groups packed up their briefcases and followed him. They were not going to touch a property encumbered by a bulletproof, ironclad 99-year lease. It was a financial black hole. $4 million, the trustee asked, his voice echoing in the rapidly emptying room. $3 million. $2 million. Linda let out a small, strangled whimper. She gripped the edge of the wooden bench in front of her, her knuckles trembling. The millions she had counted on the grand settlement that was supposed to save her and Chase was evaporating into thin air right in front of her eyes. "Do we have any bids for this property?" the trustee asked, a note of finality creeping into his voice. "If there are no bids, the asset will remain with the creditors." From the third row, Harrison calmly stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his immaculate suit and raised a small white numbered paddle. "I represent a private holding company," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute surgical precision. "We offer an opening bid of $250,000. Linda gasped, spinning around in her seat. Her eyes locked onto Harrison, and then slowly they tracked to the back of the room and landed directly on me. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The private holding company was a shell. It was me. $250,000, the trustee repeated, looking around the room. The remaining spectators were silent. The creditor's attorneys looked resigned. Something was better than nothing, and the land was commercially dead to anyone else. "Do we have any other bids?" the trustee asked. "Going once. Going twice." The heavy wooden gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. "Sold." The sound echoed in the quiet room, sealing the final fate of the Astor dynasty. For an amount that barely covered the cost of a luxury sports car, I had just purchased the underlying land to a multi-million-dollar estate. The circle was complete. The 99-year lease no longer mattered. The tenant and the landlord were now the exact same entity. I owned the dirt. I owned the buildings. I owned the client lists. I owned the legacy, 100% free and clear forever. The court was dismissed. The few remaining people began to file out. Linda remained frozen in her seat, her body rigid, staring straight ahead at the empty podium. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. I remained in my seat as Harrison walked down the aisle. He approached Linda's bench, his expression perfectly polite but devoid of any warmth. He held a thin manila folder containing the finalized auction transfer documents. He stopped beside her and gently placed the folder on the wooden bench, right next to her trembling hands. Linda slowly turned her head, looking at the documents that signified her total and complete ruin. She had lost her husband. She had lost her home. Her beloved golden son was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial, and the daughter she had treated as a disposable stepping stone had just legally acquired the entirety of the family empire for absolute pennies on the dollar. I stood up from the back row and walked slowly down the aisle. My footsteps were the only sound in the cavernous, empty courtroom. I stopped right behind Linda. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. The total victory required no theatrics. I looked down at the woman who had emotionally abandoned me for 33 years. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was low, steady, and perfectly clear. "You sold your daughter out to save a son who bankrupted you," I whispered the words, slicing through the sterile air. "You have exactly 48 hours to pack your bags and leave my property forever." The transition from the cold, sterile courtroom to the vibrant warmth of early summer took exactly 6 months. During that half-year, the dust from the Astor family's catastrophic implosion did not just settle. It was swept away entirely, leaving behind a pristine, unblemished landscape where my empire could finally take root without the choking weeds of my mother's expectations. The headlines had run their course, transitioning from front-page scandals to buried footnotes, but the reality of the fallout remained absolute. The legal system had moved with a swift, merciless efficiency that completely ignored the Astor name. Chase was sentenced to 84 months in a federal correctional institution. The judge had shown zero leniency, citing the sheer brazenness of the wire fraud, the calculated forgery of our late father's signature, and the malicious destruction of critical utility infrastructure. There were no suspended sentences for good behavior. There were no country club rehabilitation centers. My brother, the golden child, who had never faced a consequence heavier than a stern talking to, was now wearing a standard-issue khaki uniform. His days of trading cryptocurrency on offshore servers and ordering bottle service at velvet-roped nightclubs were replaced by rigid schedules, daily headcounts, and the bleak, terrifying reality of a 7-year sentence. The updates I received from the legal trustees painted a pathetic picture of a broken man who still could not comprehend how his bulletproof life had shattered. He had tried to leverage his old banking connections for commissary funds, only to find that his name was completely radioactive. Linda's dissent was equally absolute, though her prison lacked iron bars. True to my word, she was escorted off my property exactly 48 hours after the bankruptcy auction. Her eviction from the Connecticut mansion followed just weeks later. The bank foreclosed on the property, seizing everything inside to cover the fraudulent remortgages she had taken out to fund Chase's shadow debts. The woman who had defined her entire existence by zip codes, luxury vehicles, and exclusive invitations was forced to relocate to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a low-income complex on the outskirts of Hartford. The transition broke her. Her new reality was defined by peeling linoleum floors, noisy radiators, and neighbors who did not care about her pedigree. She had attempted to maintain her high society facade, showing up to the country club for her weekly luncheons, only to be politely but firmly turned away by management due to months of unpaid membership dues. The wealthy socialites she had considered her dearest friends stopped returning her calls the exact moment her bank accounts hit zero. In their circles, poverty was a contagion, and Linda was hopelessly infected. She spent her days sitting in a tiny, dimly lit living room, completely cut off from the glamorous world she had valued more than her own daughter. She had sacrificed her relationship with me to save her son, and in the end, she had lost both of us, along with everything she had ever cared about. The silence from my immediate family was a profound relief, but it was quickly replaced by a pathetic chorus of desperation from the extended relatives. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had happily stood by while Linda belittled my career choices, the same people who had snickered at my ambition and praised Chase's phantom successes, suddenly discovered a deep abiding affection for me. My voicemail inbox filled with a daily barrage of groveling messages. Aunt Patricia called to ask if I could possibly cover her daughter's private school tuition, citing the importance of supporting family during tough economic times. Uncle Robert left a 5-minute message explaining a brilliant new startup idea he had, asking for a modest $500,000 seed investment from his favorite, most successful niece. Cousins who had ignored my existence for a decade suddenly wanted to book their weddings at my estate, casually asking for a complete waiver of the venue fees as a family favor. They spoke with practiced sweetness, entirely ignoring the fact that they had watched my mother treat me like disposable garbage for 33 years. They expected me to fall back into the role of the compliant, desperate people-pleaser. They thought the biological connection alone would be enough to open my vault. I listened to each voicemail with clinical detachment, feeling absolutely no anger, no guilt, and no obligation. I pressed delete on every single one of them. I did not return a single call. I owed them nothing. The family I was born into had proven themselves to be parasites, and I had permanently closed the host. In stark contrast to the ruins of my past, my present was thriving with a vibrant, undeniable energy. I stood on the sweeping stone terrace of the main manor, looking out over the sprawling acres of the estate. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the manicured lawns and the perfectly blooming gardens. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh pine and blooming jasmine. The property had never looked more beautiful, more alive. Down on the grand lawn, my staff was moving with effortless precision, setting up for a massive corporate retreat scheduled for the evening. There was no frantic shouting, no last-minute panic, and no looming threat of sabotage. The operation ran like a flawless, well-oiled machine. Marcus was coordinating the audiovisual setup near the main pavilion, chatting easily with the tech crew. He caught my eye and offered a sharp, respectful salute. Harrison was stationed near the catering tents, meticulously reviewing the wine lists with the head chef, ensuring every detail met our exacting standards. These were the people who had stood by me when everything was on the line. They were not bound to me by blood, but by mutual respect, shared ambition, and unwavering loyalty. They were my chosen family. I walked down the wide stone steps, the gentle breeze catching the hem of my lightweight blazer. I moved through the gardens, greeting my staff, checking on the floral arrangements, and absorbing the atmosphere of total, unadulterated peace. There was no mother hovering over my shoulder, criticizing my posture or my business model. There was no brother plotting to steal my client lists or tear down my infrastructure. The estate was entirely, completely mine. Near the edge of the rose garden, Wyatt was standing with a group of investors who had flown in to review our quarterly expansion plans. He was no longer just the head of my security detail. His firm had become an integral, highly compensated partner in my corporation's logistical planning. He saw me approaching and excused himself from the group, stepping forward with a genuine, relaxed smile. "The perimeter is entirely secure, Erica," Wyatt said, his tone carrying a light, teasing edge that had developed over the last few months. The caterers are prepped, the guests are arriving in exactly 1 hour, and there is not a single pair of bolt cutters within a 50-mile radius. I smiled a real, unburdened smile that reached my eyes. "Thank you, Wyatt. For everything." He nodded, his expression turning sincere. "You built this, Erica. You earned every square inch of it." I turned away from him and looked back up at the main manor house. The historic red brickwork had been painstakingly restored, glowing warmly in the late afternoon sun. The tall, elegant windows reflected the bright blue sky, projecting an image of absolute permanence and strength. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, fresh air of my own property. For 33 years, I had been told I was not enough. I had been instructed to shrink myself, to suppress my ambition, and to sacrifice my own future to support the fragile egos of the people who shared my last name. They had expected me to fold. They had expected me to surrender my business, my assets, and my dignity the moment they demanded it. They had genuinely believed that my loyalty to a toxic family dynamic would override my own instinct for survival. They were wrong. I did not just survive their betrayal. I did not just endure their coordinated attempts to strip away everything I had worked for. I turned their greed against them. I used their own massive, catastrophic arrogance as the very foundation for my absolute victory. I took the dirt they tried to sell out from under me, and I built an empire on the exact ruins they expected me to die in. I owned the land, I owned the legacy, and for the first time in my entire life, I completely owned myself. The story of Erica's ultimate triumph over her brother's deceit and her mother's enabling behavior offers a profound lesson about the true nature of family and the absolute necessity of uncompromising boundaries. For too long, society has peddled the dangerous myth that blood is an unconditional mandate for limitless forgiveness. We are taught to endure toxic dynamics, to set ourselves on fire, to keep our relatives warm, and to accept betrayal simply because it comes from someone who shares our last name. Erica's journey shatters that illusion. True loyalty is a two-way street built on mutual respect and shared integrity, not an unpayable debt extracted through guilt and manipulation. When Chase forged signatures, committed fraud, and endangered hundreds of lives, Linda's immediate instinct was not to seek accountability, but to demand Erica's total financial and emotional ruin to shield the golden child. Linda proved that she viewed Erica not as a beloved daughter, but as a disposable resource. The most powerful takeaway from this confrontation is that you are not obligated to save the very people who actively handed you the matches. Protecting your hard-earned legacy, your peace of mind, and your future is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and self-respect. Sometimes the healthiest, most empowering choice you can make is to plug in the Drive project, The Ugly Truth, on a 20-foot screen and let the consequences fall exactly where they belong. You have the absolute right to curate your life and evict the toxicity that seeks to drag you down. Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand with toxic family members to protect your own peace and hard work? Share your story of setting boundaries and reclaiming your power in the comments below. If Erica's uncompromising stand resonated with you, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of sweet revenge and self-discovery, and remember, your legacy belongs to you alone.